Chapter 2339. Lu Xiaoyi had gained a lot from this trip. This insight phenomenon crisis had allowed him to obtain benefits in all aspects from beginning to end. The complete three wholes as one, the complete devouring great Tao, and the hidden revolutionary power of the main world. The only regret was that Yin Pa Shi seemed to be on guard against him, not giving him any chance. Now that this matter was over, it was time to leave. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly felt something, so he stopped and stood there silently. A moment later, time suddenly stopped, as if everything had entered an instant of stillness. Even the operation of the gray hole temporarily stopped. The next moment, there was a continuous sound of shattering, extremely clear. Saint Virtue, blessed virtue, nether virtue. 3 Taoists collapsed. The West Sea was like a pot of boiling water. Countless figures rose into the air. The continuous chanting of Buddha's name rose and fell one after another. There was excitement in the sadness. 3 Taoists collapsed at once, and now there were already 20 great Taoists that were no longer there. The monks pursued their great Taoists with complicated feelings, but Lu Xiaoyi did not join them. At the same time, when 3 great Taoists collapsed, countless insights poured into his mind. That was the nostalgia and recollection of the lost companions when the 36 innate great Taoists were as one. Just by these sorrowful thoughts, he had already vaguely touched the true essence of these 3 great Taoists, and the rest was just the refinement of time. After cultivating for 3,000 years, he finally passed the most important juncture of great Taoists, and no longer needed the help of great Tao fragments to fully comprehend great Taoists. Just like this time, he achieved the goal of understanding through the resonance of the 36 innate great Taoists. Of course, this method could only be used by him. For others, their bodies had not been transformed into a small universe, and they had not cultivated so many great Tao concepts. It was a kind of understanding of great Tao that could not be replicated. As time passed, more and more great Taoists collapsed. It would be easier for him to comprehend. In the end, he did not even need the great Tao to collapse, and before that, he could deduce the great Taoists that did not collapse through most of the other great Taoists. It was a gradual process, and the great Taoists were interconnected. Now that he had mastered more than 20 great Taoists, the rest were no longer mysterious to him, and it was natural for him. He no longer needed to rack his brains to snatch them. He finally had the demeanor of a grand cultivator. There were still 4 more, and he would reach the threshold of the collapse of the 24 great Tao, which was also the opportunity for him to take the second step. For this, he had already prepared for many years, especially this time. The heavenly insight opened up a new horizon for him. Now, the understanding of the 36 innate Taoists was no longer the top priority. What was more important to them now was to create their own Taoists. Learn, understand, deepen, draw inferences, and then create. Polishing. Perfect. Take shape. This was what a cultivator should do. However, the feeling of pursuing the great way through action was still very nostalgic. Looking at the busy monks, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. This kind of happiness no longer belonged to him. To him, it was the end of the story. In his melancholy, his body began to rise. This time, he planned to go to the Heaven's Choice continent through the exterior. He had already decided that before going to the land of the Yellow Dragon, he would enter the Sword Tao Steel for the 3rd time. This was because he didn't know when the Sword Tao Steel would disappear as the number of Tao Steels on the Heaven's Choice continent increased. That book contained Li Wuya's ultimate understanding of the way of the sword. There were things that had not been left behind in other places. With his current level of insight, he needed to understand it well and see how he could pass down Li Wuya's set of things. This was his responsibility. He had the obligation to contribute to the inheritance of the Sword Tao, whether it was his own things or others, including Chonglu's, Sanqin's, Wu Shixing's, Hu Xuedao's. They all left something in the Sword Tao Steel that they didn't leave behind at the dome of Shao Mountain. These could not be lost. As he rose up, Lu Xiaoyi couldn't help but think of a human face in his heart. Sinbai, this Taoist had already proven his ability. Next was the stage of equal exchange between the two. He didn't know what this guy with great magical powers needed his help with. He was very calm. Lu Xiaoyi appeared in the vicinity of Zhou Xian's bounded domain. This was because this was the place in the negative space that was closest to the Heaven's Choice continent. Since he was already on the way, he didn't mind going in to take a look. Some old people, some old sights, they were all missing. The chessboard of heaven and earth could be considered an old friend of his. It turned a blind eye to his arrival, and even took the initiative to remove the traces of him crossing the boundary to show its friendliness. Of course, he didn't need this now. When he first came to Zhou Xian, the chessboard of heaven and earth looked extremely domineering and mysterious. Now, in his eyes, it had long lost that feeling. It was just an outdated, innate spiritual treasure. He remembered that when he first came, he was treated as a pawn. At that time, he was dissatisfied and swore that one day he would capture all the true monarchs of Zhou Xian to be his chess pieces. Thinking about it now, his ambition at that time was very laughable. Now, he could do it and even control the chessboard of heaven and earth itself. But that ambition was long gone. Simple happiness, if you didn't do it at that time, it wouldn't be considered as happiness. Therefore, one must enjoy life to the fullest. This sentence really explained the true meaning of life. It wasn't that people would change, but that happiness would change. Just like the current him, it was already very difficult for him to find something that could truly make him happy to do. If happiness wasn't there, what was the meaning of life? Was it only supported by a sense of responsibility? How long could it last? He first came to Shaking Shadow, the place where the Zhou Xian sword vein had risen. More than 2,000 years had passed, and it was still the same. The only difference was that it was even more prosperous. In these 2,000 years, many things had happened here, but overall, it was still relatively smooth. There were 3 points that guaranteed the rise of the Shaking Shadow sword vein. First of all, Zhou Xian itself was a relatively stable environment. This was very important to the development of a sect. Furthermore, the Shaking Shadow sword vein was somewhat special in Zhou Xian. The few upper realms had taken special care of it. This was something that the other sword vein couldn't compare to. Secondly, there were still a few Shaking Shadow veterans in the swordsman army that had followed Lu Xiaoyi on the expedition. In the end, they chose to return to their roots. For cultivators with limited prospects, this was a very normal choice. They were the backbone that supported the Shaking Shadow sect, and thus laid a solid foundation for the Shaking Shadow sect. The scope of the Shaking Shadow sect disciples was not just limited to the Shaking Shadow sect, but also all the talents in Zhou Xian who were interested in the path of the sword. Finally, because of an important person in the Shaking Shadow sect, Lu Zhu, to the Shaking Shadow sect, having someone in the upper realms wasn't just a lie. They really did have someone. This thigh was very thick, so thick that it wasn't just the Shaking Shadow sect thigh, it was also the thigh of Zhou Xian, and even the thigh of the rising powers in the entire universe. Who would dare to challenge such an orthodoxy? This was also the reason why the Shaking Shadow sect was so glorious now. Chapter 2340. However, all of this was meaningless to their thigh, Lu Zhu. That was because he didn't recognize anyone anymore. It had become unfamiliar. It had become faintly alienated. He was very clear that this might indeed be his sword vein. But it was only a sword vein with the mark of Zhou Xian. It didn't have the mark of the 5th ring Xianyuan sword vein. This wasn't their fault. It was just the environment. Although there weren't many sword vein in the universe, that was only relatively speaking. There were still quite a few of them. They couldn't become Xianyuan because they didn't have the environmental conditions to become Xianyuan. For example, the Shaoying sword vein in Zhou Xian was like a flower in a greenhouse. It was the temperament of the entire Zhou Xian. It didn't have the courage and bravery of Xianyuan. This couldn't be forced out. It could only be subtly influenced by the environment. Therefore, the reason why Xianyuan became Xianyuan was also because of the environment. In front of him was Qin Kong's Wuzhou, and behind him was the fifth ring of the universe. He was always on tenterhooks as he wandered, facing all kinds of suppression at any time and place. Therefore, he was ground into the sharpest sword in the universe. The tip of this sword was Li Wuya. Now the hilt was Lu Xiaoyi. They were all flying forward with this sword in their own way, flying towards the light or the darkness. He stayed quietly outside the Xiaoying small realm, quietly paying homage. Often, there would be young swordsmen who would roar past him, but no one could discover this almost transparent shadow. That was a high-level application of the light and darkness space. It was something that ordinary cultivators couldn't understand. When he was young, he was very curious about those big cultivators who stood with their hands behind their back and meditated like a wooden chicken. He thought that it was just a kind of posture. Life was short. If they had the time to stand here and stare blankly, they might as well do something practical. But now, he understood that it wasn't really a daze. It was the long river of memories, remembering the things that they had lost. Those regrets, those joys, those setbacks, those successes, those things, those people. When he realized that he could finally understand these things, he knew that he was old. Unconsciously, he began to understand Li Wuya's feelings at that time. This is very dangerous. He reminded himself, in his heart, in a cultivator's life, the state of mind was a very strange thing. There was no end to it, and there was always room for improvement. However, the ancient books of cultivation often mention the law of the change of the state of mind between yuanying and yuanying. There were very few people who talked about the change of the state of mind for higher-level cultivators. It seemed that once a cultivator reached the level of true monarch or half-immortal, there was no need for a state of mind, or perhaps the state of mind had already reached perfection. This is wrong. The higher one's realm was, the more inexplicable those mental states were. The simplest emotion was also the most hurtful emotion. It was like a piece of fine sandpaper, gently rubbing against the softest part of your heart. Rub you until your life is bleak and desolate, and you are full of melancholy. Where will you return to? Loneliness, loneliness. This was the emotion he often felt now. Looking at the objects reminded him of her, and he felt even more melancholy. This was not an emotion that he should be feeling right now. It was too early. Just like the first sentence on the title page of Li Wuya's biography, I don't want to be an emotionless rock. Lu Xiaoyi turned around and left. He also didn't want to. He didn't go to the carefree continent because he didn't want to cause trouble. The old man with white eyebrows was very unusual. He might not be able to escape the perception of such an old fox. He couldn't face the old man with white eyebrows. He didn't know what to say to him. This old man was also a very curious person. With the character of the people in Zhou Xian, they wouldn't be able to accept it if he revealed a little bit of this matter. They might not be willing to accept it either. It'd be very awkward. It was better not to meet him, so as to avoid roasting the old man with white eyebrows. If Senior Kawa wasn't here, the carefree continent might not be so carefree for him. He came to another continent, the Yellow Court continent. In Lu Xiaoyi's life, excluding those who spent money and occasions, there were only about 2 women who were serious, Han Yin and Xia Bingji. Han Yin didn't need to think about it. She had the body of a phoenix. After her identity was clear, she wouldn't have any contact with human men. This was good for both of them. Xia Bingji had a firm Taoist heart. She was indifferent to the relationship between men and women. Since the two of them broke up on the Rustar Jindan, she had always had this attitude. This made Lu Xiaoyi, who appeared to be cheerful and indifferent but was actually proud in his heart, couldn't be as shameless as those people in the secular world. He was a person who respected others, especially women. What made him depressed was that in his cultivation life, he had many senior sisters. Yin Song, Yin Dai, and Kawa were the few who were close to him. However, they all lacked the opportunity to break through the window paper. He felt strange. Why weren't the others like this? The good women he met were all devoted to the Taoist path and didn't care about the relationship between men and women. Yin Song was needless to say. Jean Eyre was Bu Yin's. Maybe he was a little mischievous at the beginning, but later he really treated her as an elder sister. But what about the others? Even though he boasted that he was experienced and had great means, and could be considered a little divine master in the field of flowers, he didn't seem to have been in a real relationship. Many of them went straight to the point. They only focused on the results and didn't talk about the process. He finally realized the difference between him and Li Wuya. Li Wuya had a wife, but he didn't. Li Wuya had an unforgettable love, but he didn't. Why? This was what he had been struggling with. It wasn't until Yin Dai left him a letter at the dome that he understood a little. On the surface, the letter asked him to take over the 5th ring navigation study. However, this was just a pretense. The real content was to remind him that he had made a huge mistake in his relationship with his senior sisters. That was, when he was dating a woman, when the other party said no, it was possible that she didn't think so in her heart, especially for those women who were proud and didn't want to belittle themselves. In this case, the solution was very simple. Use force. Of course, it was appropriate force. This involved a very subtle, psychological confrontation between a man and a woman. To put it simply, Lu Xiaoyi was too outstanding. He was so outstanding that he didn't realize what his status was in other people's eyes. However, on the surface, he appeared too casual, too frivolous, and too impatient. This would give people the impression that he didn't care about anything, that he was just playing around, and that he didn't take anything seriously. If the target he chose also had such a character, then it would be like a tortoise looking at a mung bean, and they would hit it off immediately. However, the key point was that Lu Xiaoyi didn't like this kind of person. He only liked those who were truly outstanding cultivators. This created a misunderstanding. Lu Xiaoyi thought that he was respecting others. He worked hard to maintain this demeanor, but in reality, he was hurting others and hurting himself. His senior sisters didn't want to lose their modesty so easily. They had thought that as this person grew older, there would be a day when he would be enlightened. Who would have thought that this idiot had already enlightened all the other orifices except for this one? When they finally understood Lu Xiaoyi's character, because they had been reserved for too long, it had formed a cold habit. They could no longer take the initiative to make concessions and hint at him. Gradually drifting away, good things come with setbacks. Chapter 23:41. Xia Bingji gently lifted her skirt and slowly glided in the valley under the night sky. This was her valley, a place that belonged to her alone. From the time Jean Dan was assigned to this valley, it had never changed until the current supreme Sun Spirit. She hadn't taken that step yet, but she knew that she would take that step sooner or later. Under the almost old-fashioned cultivation system of Huangting Taoism, most cultivators were like her. They just followed their own pace and didn't change anything because of the changes in the outside world. This was also a kind of cultivation attitude. She liked this kind of peaceful life, but she didn't want to get involved in the storms of the universe. She didn't want to search for fragments in the universe. And she didn't want to travel thousands of miles to the land of the Yellow Dragon to observe the Tao tablets of those geniuses. That was someone else's, not hers. She only needed the ladle that belonged to her alone. Her mentality was incompatible with her peerless appearance. People always thought that the most beautiful flowers should bloom in a place where hundreds of flowers bloomed to receive the attention of thousands of people and listen to the praise of thousands of people. But she wasn't like that. She liked to bloom in a cold and empty valley and only show her beauty to the people closest to her. If there were no other people, then she would bloom for herself to admire. Since she was a child, she had always been the one who attracted the most attention. Not only was her cultivation potential outstanding, but it also showed in every other special aspect. She could play the most beautiful zither, write the most artistic calligraphy, and draw the most spiritual mountains and rivers. Her flower beds were always lush, and the elixirs she refined were praised by even the masters of alchemy. In every aspect, she strived to reach the peak. She was the best, the disciple of others. She was the only one who knew that, even though she was putting on a show for others, she didn't like it herself. She was a person who lived for others, for the sake of those hypocritical, competitive people. It wasn't until her realm slowly rose that she realized what her real hobby was, which was doing nothing, sleeping in, being in a daze with nothing to do. There was no pressure to plan. There was no struggle under pressure. If I had to ask her what her hobby was, it would probably be swimming. She liked to be free like a fish and enjoy the gentleness of the water. She floated in the water and completely isolated herself from the ever-changing world of cultivation, even if she was deceiving herself. Therefore, she was rarely as busy as other supremes in the universe. She could easily manage her own life and cultivation, and her realm was actually not left behind by others. In Huangting Taoism, everyone praised her for her innate Taoist qualities and that she would become an immortal in the future without any effort. Regarding this, she only smiled faintly. No one understood her. She was a person who wouldn't give herself any pressure, but at her current level of cultivation, who in Yellow Court Mountain could give her any more pressure. She liked this remote valley for a very simple reason. It was because of the secluded spring in the valley. Every time she soaked in the spring water, she would be far away from the faint loneliness. It was as if this was her universe, her everything. Just like now, he had solved a thorny cultivation problem in a few short years of seclusion, and the first thing he did after coming out was to return to the embrace of the spring water. There was no other person in the entire valley. This was Huangting Taoism, and she was the top young spirit supreme here. For 1,000 years, no one dared to intrude without notice, because she was Xia Bingji, the fairy of Huangting, and also the fairy of Zhouxian. Anyone who dared to blaspheme would be torn to pieces without her having to do anything. She swam in the water like a fish. The familiar temperature and the familiar fragrance of the water were her world. It was really difficult to cultivate alone. It wasn't because of the so-called cultivation method in Tao realm, but because of the loneliness that would always exist and couldn't be dispelled. People, one stroke and one restraint, were supposed to support each other. Just a stroke, and she couldn't stand firm. It wasn't her body that couldn't stand firm, but her mind that couldn't stand firm. Would she become a stone after cultivating? Then she would really become a stone woman. In her life, there weren't many things worth remembering because they were all familiar scenes, familiar contents, and the same process, making it hard for people to recall them. The only thing that she couldn't forget from time to time seemed to be a memory. If she didn't mention the reflection after waking up, that should be the happiest year of her life, right? Even if she was actually deceived. No one knew that the famous and pure ice fairy in the immortal of Zhou actually had such an unbearable past. And this period of the past had actually become one of the few days that she could count on her fingers to remember. The fairy's coldness was a template that people talked about enthusiastically, but no one knew how much of a price one had to pay to maintain such coldness. If a person was like this, how can a mortal endure it? She couldn't believe it. If a person like her really became an immortal, how could she spend the endless years? What was worse was that the more indifferent she was, the more natural the improvement of her realm became. She was speechless when she saw others flattering her on the surface and secretly envying her. She didn't want to explain anything. The more she explained, the more others would say she was pretentious. Maybe she was indeed a bit pretentious. She cultivated to a level that the vast majority of cultivators in the origin world couldn't even dream of, but she still felt sorry for herself. I'm really lonely. If you don't reach this realm, you'll never be able to understand this feeling. And when you reach this realm, you disdain to explain it to the masses. You can't explain it to them. This wasn't just her problem, but everyone who reached this level had a problem. The only difference was that everyone had a different way to deal with it. But among all the methods, the most unreliable was to make new friends. People like them had long passed the age of heart to heart. Now was the principle of exchange of benefits. If friend were like this, then there was no need to mention the deeper level of relationship between a man and a woman. The universe was vast, beyond supremes. Unless it was for mutual assistance in cultivation, dual cultivation, she had never heard of anyone staying together just because they liked each other. She had long understood this principle, but what made her speechless was that she still had a trace of expectation. A young girl's feelings were always poetic. The charm of cultivation was that it could keep you young forever. When you put on makeup in front of a mirror and saw a face as beautiful as a flower, a poetic feeling would naturally come, unstoppable. But when you saw a face full of orange peels, what was worse was that her appearance hadn't disappeared, but instead became more and more crystal clear. Floating in the spring water was the only place where she could allow herself to let her imagination run wild. Once she reached the shore, all these thoughts would leave her, and she would once again return to that pure and untainted ice fairy who didn't eat the food of mortals. Just as she was still immersed in her little thoughts, she slightly turned her body, intending to slide over a coral reef. But with this movement, she immediately felt that something was wrong. Her body inexplicably felt a strange sense of powerlessness. This was simply impossible for a young spirit. She raised her elemental energy again, but there was still no response. She had been plotted against. Who was it? How could they be so bold? Chapter 2342. P.S. The activity at the starting point makes people speechless. When I ask for tickets, I only ask for the tickets in your pocket. Don't forget, I don't want you to spend money. Subscriptions and monthly tickets are the greatest support for me. If I asked for anything else, it would be too much. Reading books quietly, enjoying our dream of cultivating immortality, and relaxing yourself in the dream. This is what sloth can give you. And you have already given sloth too much. Some friends take the initiative to tip me, and I still want to thank you. But in this fickle world, there are some things that can't be changed. So, we don't fight for anything. Ever since I was a sword disciple, I have had this attitude. Thank you again to all my friends. If you like it, you can subscribe. Reading should be a very clean thing, and it's not good to talk too much. Xia Bingji had never thought that in Huangting Mountain, the important place of her sect, where there were many big formations and experts, someone would sneak in and attack her. What was the purpose? What was the intention? Was it an individual action? Or was it targeted at Huangting Mountain? She remained calm and collected. After all, she was a young spirit supreme. She wouldn't scream and panic like a little girl. Although she hadn't experienced many life and death situations in her 3,000 years of cultivation, the calm temperament unique to Huangting Taoism still made her feel stormy in her heart, but she still looked calm on the surface. She used the most hidden secret method to save herself. She was very clear that if the opponent could attack a peak young spirit like her without making a sound, he or she would be at least at the same level as her, or maybe even higher. Therefore, she couldn't expose that she had noticed her abnormality and needed to solve it secretly. At the same time, she was ready to send out a warning. She was still worried that this was an action against Huangting Taoism. This was her first instinct as a young spirit supreme cultivator. If it was a single person, then it might be the heart compass borrowing Tao realm that had been rumored recently. She wasn't too worried about this. Anyway, she didn't take the so-called fragment of the Great Way too seriously. As for beauty, this was the most impossible. This was the thought of mortals. No one would have any designs on a yang god or Kuan Dao because it was almost impossible to control. If they wanted to take another step forward, it would be no different from courting death. However, her judgment was obviously wrong. Her opponent was very experienced. He immediately made his move the moment she noticed it. Before she could react, a pair of large hands had already touched her waist from behind. After removing her defense in an instant, a layer of goosebumps appeared all over her body. The big hand moved slowly. At the same time, the two bodies intimately stuck together. This made Xia Bingji realize that she was in danger for the first time in her life. No, it was the second time. For the first time, someone had approached her from behind and hugged her waist while spouting nonsense. She tried her best to remain calm because she might only have one chance. This person's strength was too terrifying. Until now, she still didn't know how this person approached her without making a sound. How did she suddenly lose the ability to resist? She only had one chance, and it was the final move that every Kuan cultivator would prepare for themselves. She did not care about her own life or death. but she must make this thief pay the price. A scorching breath came to her ear, and someone chuckled in her ear. Did you remember something? We thought about it and used all kinds of methods, but we didn't think about it in the water. Do you want to try? Xiao Bingji's body trembled. As soon as this person spoke, she knew who this evil thief was. If it wasn't for the fact that the memory from more than 2,000 years ago was too distant, she should have already judged it from the breath, temperature, skin, and the technique of his hands. Her strength instantly returned to her body, and she regained control of her body. This was not because her secret technique had succeeded, but because the evil thief had taken the initiative to withdraw. However, she still did not look back and tried to speak in a stiff tone. We had an agreement. The voice behind her was very rogue. An agreement has a time limit. This is not the style of a cultivator. You are also not a foundation establishment, Jean Dan. Don't talk to me about the code of conduct of cultivators. If a foundation establishment, Jean Dan, can do it, there is no reason that a half-immortal can't do it. Lu Xiaoyi, don't make me look down on you. The voice was unmoved, and his hands were still strong. In this universe, I'm afraid that you are the only one who dares to look down on me. I'm sorry for using this method to look at you. There is no other reason. I just miss you. Xiao Bingji's heart softened, and her eyes became a little moist. She had been waiting for this sentence for more than 2,000 years, waiting for this person to be unreasonable. But she didn't expect that this person would change from a swindler to a gentleman. The voice was still whispering. Cultivation is too tiring. There wasn't even a single person who could speak properly. I'm afraid that if I continue like this, I will turn into a stone. So, I wanted to find you. Let's think together and think of a way. Xiao Bingji choked. What if I don't want to? The voice chuckled. You have met a swindler, but I don't know if you have met a rapist. The two of them thought for the whole night. From the spring to the shore, they finally thought of the soft bed. After a night of torment, the young spirit's body was naturally fine, but his mood was tired. After waiting for 2,000 years, he suddenly relaxed. She glared at him. Why did you suddenly think of coming back? You've been thinking for more than 2,000 years. Lu Xiaoyi hugged her apologetically. This can only mean one thing. A woman's mind is even more difficult to understand than the 36 connate great Taoists. And I don't seem to have any talent in this area. This was his real purpose for coming to Zhou Xian, to make up for his regrets. He had wasted more than 2,000 years. In the end, if senior sister Yindai hadn't reminded him, he would probably never be able to make up for this regret in this life. He claimed to be a friend of women, but in fact, he didn't understand women at all. Ever since he came to this world, he had never experienced a serious relationship. It didn't matter if it was spectacular or ordinary. Some things were better after experiencing it. Only then would one know how to cherish it and know that it was not easy to get. Before becoming a stone, everyone had a soft heart. Only by being warm to each other could they go further. He didn't subconsciously see her as a burden and fear her like a tiger. He was very curious. Actually, at that time, I really wanted to be together, but I was afraid that forcing you would make you unhappy. Xiao Bingji asked, forcing? Why didn't you consider forcing yourself on Rust Planet? In the end, after achieving your goal, you suddenly became a gentleman? Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. It's a pity that it's been 2,000 years. How many times would I have thought less? Couldn't you have given me a hint back then? Xiao Bingji was very serious. At that time, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to give up cultivation. I was afraid that these problems would affect my state of mind. I couldn't make up my mind, so I hoped that you would be more proactive. In the end, you looked indifferent. The two of them hugged tightly. Even though they were the most powerful cultivators in the world, they seemed to be two independent people who supported each other. In fact, they didn't say that the frivolity and ignorance of their youth and their confidence in the future made them not care about these things at that time. However, as time passed, they gradually realized that they had lost the most precious thing. In a mortal world, it was destined to be a tragedy caused by arrogance and conceit. There was no room for redemption. Fortunately, they were cultivators. The long years gave them a chance to correct themselves. This time, Lu Xiaoyi didn't miss the opportunity. Before he came here, He didn't even think about what would happen if he was really rejected. He just didn't want to leave any regrets in his life. It seemed that this was not the only regret. Chapter 23:43. There was finally laughter in the valley, which was precious to people like them. Simple happiness was so easy for mortals, but for people like them, it was harder than ascending to the heavens. For a 1,000-year-old monster, it was a kind of happiness for them to find someone they could completely relax in front of. They didn't have to think about what they should and shouldn't say, and they could indulge their bad habits that they never showed on the outside. They had known each other for more than 2,000 years. Although there was a long gap in between, they could be considered as an old couple after 2,000 years of caring for each other. Although they no longer had the rash passion of their youth, time had brewed this experience into old wine, which had its own mellowness and longevity. They had their own way of getting along. Taoist Huanjin and 3 other old Taoists came to the Horseshoe Valley together. The reason why it was named Horseshoe Valley was because there was a small lake in the shape of a horse's hoof. In the 100,000 mountains of Huangting Taoism, the scenery was ordinary. However, because of a cultivator here, the Horseshoe Valley was now a very famous place among the Huangting Mountains. The beast was noble because of its owner, and the land was named after its owner. The owner of the Horseshoe Valley was the famous ice fairy in Huangting Taoism. She chose this place as her abode when she was in Jindan. She cultivated until she reached Yang spirit and became the most powerful cultivator in Huangting Taoism. She had never changed her abode for more than 2,000 years. It was not that she was not qualified, but every cultivator had their own preferences and habits. It was nothing for her. She could wander her whole life and not establish her abode. Huangting Taoism was a very strict and old-fashioned sect. Their old-fashioned style was not shown in the creation of martial arts, but in the persistence of the ancient system. They never went with the flow and chased after new things. This had not changed for thousands of years. Changes in the outside world kept on coming and going. In the end, they returned to the rhythm of ancient times, which was not considered to be out of touch with the times. In the construction of the Mountain Gate, Huangting Taoism was one of the few sects that made full use of the power of the big formation. Not only did they have the big formation of the Mountain Gate, but they also had the small formations of the peaks and valleys, which were all taken care of by the sect. This was the old school's way of doing things. They were a bit stricter when it came to the personal privacy of cultivators, unlike the casual, carefree mountain sect. They took care of the specific mountains and valleys themselves, so no one would care about these trivial matters. Huangting's way of doing things was helpful in managing middle and low-level cultivators. Of course, at the realm of Yuanying, with privacy, it was normal to add a layer of concealment. This was the right of a superior. Most people would exercise such a right. Cultivators valued privacy very much. There were also those who did not care and were selfless. The ice fairy was such a cultivator. The small array in the Horseshoe Valley had always been managed by the sect, and no private array was set up. However, the more it was like this, the more no one dared to rashly enter, because the Sun God Supreme himself was the most dangerous array. Recently, a very inexplicable piece of news came from the main array of the Mountain Gate. The ice fairy, who had lived alone for thousands of years, actually showed that there were often 2 people living together in the past few months. This was a very unexpected discovery. It wasn't that the disciple controlling the array did it on purpose. It was just that the small array was displayed in such a manner. Since the ice fairy didn't mind the existence of the small array, some basic information would appear on the pivot button of the array, clearly visible. Was it a little abnormal? The Yuanying controlling the array didn't dare to neglect or question it. He could only report it step by step. In fact, he still admired and respected the ice fairy. The ice fairy was Huangting's business card and face, so it was normal for everyone to pay special attention to her. Cultivators, of course, could have their own friends outside. Not to mention a few months, even if they lived here for a lifetime, no one would deliberately care. Even the Zhuji Feis had such a right, not to mention the top of the sect pyramid, the Sun God Supreme. In theory, not to mention one more person in the valley, even if there were hundreds or thousands of people, this was the right of the sun god supreme, and no one would say anything. But the ice fairy was different. This was an instinct in the subconscious of human beings. The ice fairy could live alone until she grew old, but if there were guests in her room, of course, no one would really think so. The ice fairy's character was famous in the whole of Zhou for her self-respect. She was simply the role model of the word fairy. Could it be that she was a friend of a cooing guest? The matter was not big, but in recent months, the Taoist in charge of transporting and purchasing things to the valley had reported that there were really two people in the valley, and the one living with the ice fairy was really a man. The food had also changed from vegetables, fruits, and other bland things to big fish and meat. There were also barrels of good wine. The ice fairy had a simple personality, and there were only a few houses in her cave. Now, there was one more person, and there were no new buildings in the valley. The upper echelons of the Yellow Court Tao sect were gossiping about this. If a man had gossip, it was romantic, and dual cultivation was practicing martial arts. But if it happened to a role model like the ice fairy, a role model also needed to be packaged. Although it had no practical significance, it also involved the face of a big Taoist. If she was a notorious slut, it would be fine, but her image to the outside world was that of a fairy. She couldn't just change her image casually, could she? It was a headache. After all, her status, strength, and realm were not something that could be criticized by just one sentence. They couldn't even talk about it specifically. They could only beat around the bush when facing each other. The problem of personal morality was a taboo among the higher-ups. After thinking it over and over again, it wasn't good to be straightforward, but it also couldn't be ignored. Left with no other choice, a few of the most respected and experienced old yang gods of the Golden Court could only find an excuse to come together. They used the opportunity of discussing the recent situation in the universe and the collapse of the three fragments to enter the valley to investigate. While they were at it, they also wanted to see who this divine being was. How could he dare to pluck the most beautiful flower in all of Zhou under broad daylight? It was fine if they secretly ate and took it, but they didn't even show their faces. They didn't even see her family. It was the first time these old young gods had done such a thing. It was very awkward, but they had to come because Taoist Huanjin had given a strict order. No one was allowed to hide from this kind of embarrassing internal affairs. When they came to the entrance of the valley, Taoist Huanjin's face was calm, and he coughed lightly. "Junior sister, we came here by chance, because we were worried about the recent chaos of the fragments of the three virtues. We happened to pass by the valley after drinking, so we wanted to ask Junior Sister's opinion on this matter. Is it convenient for Junior Sister?" A bright voice came from the valley. "Senior brothers, I'm really uneasy about your presence. It's just a small matter. You could just tell me. Why do you have to come here personally? Please come in. I happen to have some good tea." The old Taoists touched each other's divine senses and shook their heads. Just by hearing this voice, they knew that the rumors outside were mostly true. Before this ice fairy only had one sentence. "It's private, not official business. I'll just follow senior brother to the main hall." This was troublesome. Chapter 2344. The old Taoists braced themselves and walked into the valley. The scenery had not changed. It was a small valley with several tile-roofed houses. Under the autumn sun, Junior Sister Bing was brewing tea at the stone table in front of the house. When they saw Xia Bingji again, their impression of her was still dozens or even hundreds of years ago. This was also the norm for great cultivators. It was just a matter of divine sense. Why would they need to visit in person? It was also because of this that their purpose of coming here was not pure. It was somewhat deliberate. This fairy was somewhat different from dozens of years ago. It was not difficult for great cultivators of the yang spirit to maintain their youth. As long as they wanted to, it was not difficult to go back and become a child. Junior Sister Bing was the same for thousands of years. She always looked like a pure young girl. This was also the age that great cultivators liked to stay the most. But now, Xia Bingji had completely changed her style. This feeling was not that of a young girl, but a young woman. It cannot be said that her appearance had changed drastically, but there was a special aura on her face. Was it vitality? Was it budding? Was it glowing? In any case, it was like a 1,000-year-old flower that was suddenly watered and fertilized by someone. The old Taoists sat down in front of the stone table awkwardly, but their awkwardness had just begun. Not only was there the fragrance of tea in the air, but there was also an even stronger smell. It seemed to be coming from a tile-roofed house. Was that the smell of stewed meat? There was a lot of ingredients. Ganoderma, snow lotus, ginseng, wolfberry, cordyceps, oysters, walnuts, Rehmannia, longjiang. 4 great cultivators with sharp senses like them. They knew what was in it with just a sniff of their nose. Awkward. Extremely awkward. But the ice fairy opposite them did not feel anything. It was natural, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. What was there to be surprised about? This was the most stupid period of a woman's life. Before the tea was ready, Huanjin spoke first because they felt like they were sitting on pins and needles. They really did not know how to remain calm in such an atmosphere. Junior sister, it's like this. Recently, you have not come to the main hall to preside over the affairs of the hall. There are some things that you might not be clear about. Saint Defoe's een virtue has been lost. The universe is filled with figures searching for the fragments of the great path. It's a mess. Now that the epoch is about to change, the great Tao is gone, and the competition is getting more and more intense. There are signs of people not caring about anything. No one follows the rules anymore, and there are more cases of people seizing things by force. Xia Bingji poured tea for her senior brothers and listened quietly. She was not completely ignorant of these things. She had heard a little about it, but among the yang spirit Jinjuan of Huangting Taoism, she was famous for not caring about the truth. Even though she knew about it, it was not something that she needed to do anything about. Huanjin's expression turned serious. The collapse of the 3 virtues this time was due to some luck in Zhouxian airspace. It was probably because we had been working hard on the word virtue for a long time that we attracted a lot of fragments. This is especially true for my Golden Court sect. During the battle for fragments in outer space, we relied on our geographical advantage to obtain 6 or 7 fragments. This is also my Golden Court sect's reward. However, a half-immortal who came from afar found nothing in Zhouxian airspace. Relying on his strength, he spread the word that he wanted the people of Zhouxian to give up some fragments. The reason he relied on was the so-called boundary limit, especially for my Huangting Taoism. This matter is very difficult to deal with properly. The half-immortal group in Zhouxian is limited, and most of them have gone to the land of the Yellow Dragon. What Huanjin said was a miniature version of the actual predicament of the main world. It happened everywhere, and it was not only in Zhouxian. However, it was usually targeted at some small and medium-sized worlds. This time, he dared to threaten a big world like Zhouxian. It seemed that he was forced to do something desperate because the new epoch was imminent. The heart plate had been banned on the surface for a long time. However, in the world of cultivation, this kind of forced buying and selling had never ceased. Now, there was a new development in the heart plate technology. Under the premise that the cultivator who obtained the fragment could not be killed, this provided a way for this kind of transaction to be theoretically free of karma. Recently, it had become very popular in the world of cultivation in the universe. To put it simply, I'm not robbing or killing. I'm negotiating with you. If you give up the fragments of the heart plate, I'll give you a lot of compensation. However, how much of this was voluntary and how much of it was forced? Only God knew. The half-immortal's reasons were very good. Anyway, Supreme's like you can't make it in time for the new epoch to establish your Tao. Anyway, you have to slowly grind after the new epoch. So why not give the precious fragments to the people who need them the most? The half-immortals who are facing the threshold of establishing their Tao. This was the reason why they targeted the upper realm of Zhouxian and the Huangting Taoism, who is the biggest collector of fragments this time. How should they deal with it? It was really troublesome. Of course, it couldn't become a universal war, but if there were some half-immortals outside your world, how should you cultivate in the future? Don't go out? How could Xia Bingji have a good solution for this kind of thing? She was just a sun spirit. In the current environment, the inner and outer realm were completely open, and the half-immortals came down in groups. Her sun spirit had long lost the ability to decide the situation like before. She really didn't know what good solution she could come up with. This was just an excuse to cover up another matter. Therefore, he explained, our idea is to see how many Zhou Xian half-immortals can come back. Then we can gather more sun spirit from the world and choose a day to talk to these guests from outer space. With this kind of strength, even if we can't reach an agreement, we won't suffer a big loss. It's just that this time, the Huangting Taoism obtained the most fragments among the Zhou Xian sects, so we have to send more people. Junior sister, what do you think? Before he could finish speaking, a faint, strange sound came from the other side of the tile-roofed house. Was someone snoring? The old Taoists were even more embarrassed. They really couldn't imagine what kind of rude person would be able to lie on the couch, grind his teeth, chew his lips, and snore unscrupulously in the presence of guests. However, there were also guests here, and it was not good to ask the other guests to come out and meet them. Moreover, this snoring person might be half the owner. Xia Bingji smiled slightly. How could she not know the purpose of these senior brothers' visit? Whether it was on the surface or the hidden meaning behind it, she knew what was going on as soon as these old fogies came. However, that guy only knew how to make trouble, as if he hadn't grown up yet. Therefore, Dafa said seriously, I understand what senior brother means. You want to gather a few more sun spirits to help out. I'm duty-bound. But in fact, there's no need to be so complicated. If you make a big fuss, it will seem that I, Zhou Xian, am making a fuss over a small issue. There's no need for so many people. In a few days, I'll be going to Heaven's Choice with my husband. Why don't we take this opportunity to solve this matter? Chapter 23:45. Husband? This woman had already called him that. In the cultivation world, it was nothing new for male and female cultivators to practice dual cultivation. Many couples who practiced dual cultivation for many years ended up dying without any illness. This was the norm. Therefore, calling him husband was actually a very formal title. Xia Bingji's Dafa status made the old fogies even more embarrassed. They didn't even bother to ask why the two of them could solve this matter. Instead, they focused on the husband. Huanjin laughed awkwardly. Junior sister, you're too polite. How could you not say anything about such a big, happy event? I wonder which family's talent could win junior sister's favor. It's really a blessing accumulated for countless generations. It's just that there will be countless people in Zhou Xian who will be disappointed. Xia Bingji smiled slightly and didn't deliberately hide it. In fact, both of them didn't care about others and lived their lives behind closed doors. Why would they do it for others to see? The reason why we didn't make a big fuss and didn't tell the sect was because of our old relationship from thousands of years ago. Now that we've brought it up, we won't disturb everyone's cultivation. Husband has a strange temper and is too close to Huang Ting. I'm just afraid that we can't bear the burden. So, we can save those worldly etiquettes. Senior brothers, it's good that you know. It's not good to spread it around. I don't like it either. The old young gods felt their hearts burning. They wanted to stand up and bow to the roof, but they didn't want to lose their composure too much. Their butts couldn't sit still, so they had to stand up and drink tea. These old monsters who had been in charge of the sect for thousands of years had more or less heard about Xia Bingji's matter. But this matter couldn't be confirmed because the main person couldn't be found and the other kept his mouth shut. It was an unsolved case. In the past 2,000 years, as that person's reputation in the universe grew bigger and bigger, he was no longer a person who could be tied down by a sect or a domain. He was a real hero who could destroy stars and destroy realms when he raised his flag. In the process, he seemed to have hinted at this junior sister a few times. Even if they couldn't reconcile, they were husband and wife for a day, 100 days of grace. In this chaotic cultivation world, having such a thigh to rely on was an incomparable source of confidence. But even if this junior sister didn't spit it out, there was nothing he could do about it. In fact, the real purpose of their visit this time was that they were afraid that she had a new lover and angered her old one. If that person went crazy, who could withstand it? The worst thing was that if such a day really came, the other 9 families in Zhou would not stand on Huang Ting's side. They would definitely support that person. What would Huang Ting do then? Compared to the heart plate, they were actually more concerned about the danger of the dumb insect. Therefore, it wasn't that they didn't know the severity of the matter, but it was precisely because they knew the severity of the matter that they were extremely worried that their junior sister would be muddle-headed for a moment. Of course, it was all good now. They didn't have to worry about anything. With that person's appearance, not to mention a dozen half-immortals, even if more came, it would only take a single word from him. Huanjin laughed foolishly. That's great, that's great. Clothes are not as good as new. People are not as good as old. The friendship of youth was still the most precious. Junior sister, if that's the case, then there's really no point in having more people go. Since Bailey C doesn't want to be too ostentatious, and I, Huang Ting, am not a fox who uses the tiger's might to intimidate others, I will accept your kindness this time. I'll arrange it now and set a time. Junior sister, do you have any requests? Xiao Bingji smiled. We don't have any requests. Originally, we wanted to get up after a few days. It's not something urgent. Just arrange it. Senior brother? The few old Taoists were old and experienced. They knew that the gathering of these 2 people this time was the fire that started a prairie fire. So they shouldn't stay for long. They raised their hands to say goodbye, and Xia Bingji sent them off politely. When they reached the entrance of the valley, Taoist Huanjin couldn't help but hand over a jade slip. Junior sister, I know that you're proficient in the Tao of pills, but there are some things that you don't know too much about. Like the snow lotus, how can it be stewed with the spiritual beast meat? It's a waste of the spiritual beast. I have some recipes here. They're all the good recipes that they've collected and verified. Don't worry about the ingredients. I'll send someone to send them over later, I promise. The so-called nourishment was just a joke. Foundation establishment cultivators didn't need to worry about it, let alone the top level of mortal cultivation, half-immortals. However, life needed to be adjusted. Half-immortals and yang spirits had almost no need for the outside world. They could spend their whole lives in the Tao realm without any problem. They could sit in the immortals' cave until the end of time, and they could sleep in the clouds for 1,000 years. If that was the case, why would they need to find a partner? It was for the comfort of the soul. It was 2 different concepts on the material level. However, these 2 concepts complemented each other. For example, through some small details in life that were originally unnecessary, such as eating, sleeping, and thinking, one could complete the resonance and harmony on the spiritual level. In the end, one would be able to find happiness and also bring happiness to others. Just like a pot of flower, it needed to be watered, fertilized, and ventilated. You had to do your best to manage it so that it could bloom brightly and smell fragrant. The relationship between cultivators was also like this. There was no intense and unforgettable feeling, but there was more meaning in helping each other little by little in daily life. So Lu Xiaoyi asked for nourishment. So Xia Bingji stewed it in a big pot. So she really did provide some recipes. In fact, she was trying her best to act. Life was a play. If you acted seriously, others would believe it, and you would also believe it. Acting was deceiving people. It was also a kind act, and the role was integrated. There was only one purpose, to get the comfort of the soul, to soften one's heart, and to turn oneself into a stone as late as possible. It was too naive to talk about love at this time. Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't believe it, and Xia Bingji wouldn't believe it either. However, Lu Xiaoyi felt that Xia Bingji was a good partner to walk together with. Xia Bingji also thought so, and the result was the current situation. Deliberate? Artificial? Maybe. But if they could continue to help each other like this, it would be unforgettable. It was like time had left a mark on a person. It wouldn't be done overnight, but slowly. As long as it was long enough, it would leave a mark that couldn't be erased. Cultivators were different from mortals. A mortal's life was less than 100 years. In fact, it was tailor-made by God for how long the feelings of a living creature like human beings could last. It just happened that they were stuck. Without feelings, they were about to die. But cultivators were different. Their excessively long lives required another way, a way of management. Every successful cultivator had his or her own way of managing the mind and soul. If they couldn't do it, they would suffer from chi deviation. Between people, there's also a need for management. A little bit of truth, a little bit of coincidence, a common request, and an unchanging persistence. This was the concept of love for cultivators. Of course, for Lu Xiaoyi, it might be a little more of a physiological reaction. Chapter 2346. Why did you make such a thing? Lu Xiaoyi, will you die if you don't cause trouble? Xia Bingji looked at the carriage that Lu Xiaoyi had prepared for her and was very speechless. It was an extremely luxurious carriage. Saying that it was a carriage was not accurate. It was basically a room, a spacious space equipped with all the living facilities that one could imagine. Because this carriage was embedded with a space array, when one really walked in, it was several times bigger than it looked from the outside. What made Xia Bingji speechless was that the 9 dragon horses that were pulling the carriage looked like donkeys. It was in essence spirit beast. She did not know where this guy got it from. With his temperament, it was impossible for him to refine it himself. It must be a spoil of war. Sitting on someone else's treasure, she felt very uncomfortable in her heart. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled, I didn't steal it. It was also not stained with blood. It was given by a half-immortal friend. How could I give something unclean to my wife? Lu Xiaoyi lied to her and carried her into the carriage. Think about it yourself. There are a lot of half-immortals and a lot of idle people. With your temperament, would you be willing to show your face in public like this? Even if you were willing, I am not. Actually, I don't want to be so bored as to pretend to be a wolf with a big tail. So, it is better to show off and let them be confused. I will persuade them a few more words. This way, everyone will have face, we will be quiet, and they will not lose face. The idle people will not have anything to gossip about. They will only be guessing where this carriage came from. What kind of background does it have? Could it be that an immortal has descended to the mortal world? In the end, when the matter is solved, we will not be involved in those messy gossip. Xia Bingji snorted. However, she was satisfied with his explanation. She was indeed someone who did not want to show her face in public. Especially in this kind of situation, it would attract countless rumors. It was not good for her, Lu Xiaoyi, and Huangting Taoism. As long as the problem was solved, nothing else mattered. She didn't need fame, and neither did Lu Xiaoyi. Thus, the 9 donkeys pulled the enormous carriage and sped through the void at lightning speed. Their speed was average, but their momentum was truly magnificent. As the driver, Lu Xiaoyi covered his face and openly became her escort. Xia Bingji sat in the carriage, feeling uncomfortable all over. She liked nature and hated exaggeration. Little Li, once this matter is settled, I won't sit in this troublesome carriage again and act like a nouveau riche. Lu Xiaoyi swung his whip and laughed. If you don't want to sit, then don't sit. I have countless treasures like this. I'll try them one by one later and see which one you like. Actually, I feel that the rest of the treasured carriage doesn't matter, but the couch isn't bad, right? It's sturdy enough and has many functions. It can be used in all kinds of shapes. Xia Bingji had never been to the Heaven's Choice continent. Due to the change of era, the question of whether the Heaven's Choice continent would still exist was raised. Thus, when Lu Xiaoyi suggested that they go there to play, the woman gladly agreed. Just like whether a man was willing to attend a dinner party was more important because he had friends who he could talk to about everything. Whether a woman was willing to travel or not was not because of where to travel, but who to travel with. If it was with someone close to her, then there was no woman in this world who would be willing to stay at home for the rest of her life. The Heaven's Choice continent was the only human cultivation base in the negative space. If the positive and negative space really merged after the change of era, then its collapse was inevitable. In the main world, there was a limit to the size of celestial bodies. It was impossible for such a huge freak like the Heaven's Choice continent to exist. Thus, this might be the last time she would see it. As a high-level cultivator, this was a memory worth recalling. The treasured donkey fragrant carriage began to approach a certain space region. This was a small galaxy that had been abandoned for a long time. A few planets revolved around a star that was gradually dimming. It was slowly entering the final stage of the celestial body's life. For some unknown reason, the fragments of the three virtues were gathered in this place. This allowed the Golden Hall realm cultivators who happened to be searching this place to pick up a huge bargain. The specific reason was unknown, but the half-immortals who arrived afterwards were somewhat envious. The land of the Yellow Dragon was in the midst of establishing a Tao. Increasing one's Tao ability became the most important thing for the half-immortal sect. Although it was a bit rushed to snatch the fragments now, it was still possible. In the future, it would become more and more rushed. If they didn't make preparations early, the hope of establishing a Tao would become more and more uncertain. This was a common understanding. More than 10 half-immortals gathered in this desolate galaxy not far from Zhou, waiting for the people of Zhou to make their choice. One couldn't blame them for being arrogant. Strength was one of the reasons, but the more important reason was that Zhou had always had a weak character. If the same situation was changed to a fifth ring cultivator, they definitely wouldn't dare to be so unbridled. Even if there wasn't a big bug like Lu Xiaoyi, a fifth ring cultivator had always dared to fight. His experience of being the core of the universe's great war made others wary of taking action. This was a kind of psychological confrontation. If you were weak, then I would be stronger. Thus, they would gain the upper hand in this tug of war. Actually, to put it bluntly, they were just bullying the weak and fearing the strong. There were also some idlers from the nearby small and medium-sized realms who stayed here. There were even cultivators from Zhou. There were more than 10 of them. They didn't have to worry about what the half-immortals would do to them. They weren't on the same level, so they didn't pose any threat to these cultivators who had established a Tao. They stayed here just to see a joke. Maybe they could even take advantage of it. According to the news, the Huangting Taoism would send people to negotiate in the next few days, which was very unexpected. In their imagination, based on the usual character of the cultivators from Zhou, they would definitely wait for the half-immortals from Zhou to come over, together with a large number of Yang God from Zhou's own realm. Only then would they be able to come over to negotiate. This would take some time. Now, the Huangting Taoism was acting independently, which was completely out of their inherent style. They didn't know what would happen, so they just watched. Now, the cultivation world was really getting more and more chaotic. Not only did the half-immortals not have the bearing of a half-immortal, but even immortals occasionally came down to make trouble. There were no rules under the control of the Yang God in the cultivation world of the main world, which made people feel completely uncertain about the direction of the matter. Just as they were looking forward to it, an imposing donkey carriage appeared in the sky. It rolled over and didn't hide its intentions at all. The nine-headed dragon horse. Well, it was a little deformed, and its size seemed to have shrunk a little, but its momentum was still there. Its veins were bulging, its eyes were like torches, and its hooves were like fire. Behind it was a huge and luxurious carriage. This kind of object didn't conform to the aesthetic standards of the main world. It seemed a little too ostentatious. However, among the dozen or so half-immortals, there were also insightful people who whispered to each other, "Don't these dragon horses look like the legendary horses of the immortal court?" Chapter 2347. The treading shadow horse was a type of immortal horse in the legends. It was said that it could travel freely between the mortal and immortal worlds. Of course, it was only a legend. It was one of the countless speculations of the lower realm cultivators about the immortal court. However, they were all experienced and knowledgeable people in the origin world. There were very few species that could escape their recognition. Since more than 10 half-immortals couldn't recognize it, it meant that its origin was mysterious and unfathomable. With this initial impression, the actions of the half-immortals were somewhat cautious. The current cultivation world was extremely chaotic. Blackmail was one thing, but falling into an inexplicable danger was another. The half-immortals stared at the treasured carriage. They didn't say anything for a while. They wanted to see the identity of the person driving the carriage. Was it someone sent by the Huangting Taoism to negotiate? However, the treasured carriage didn't stop. Instead, it drew a beautiful curve and finally stopped in front of the dead and desolate star that was no longer emitting light and heat. The driver pulled the reins tightly. The 9 dragon horses galloped and raised their hoofs. One after another, they stood up and neighed loudly. They were extremely violent. However, under the comfort of the driver, they finally stopped. The carriage and the 9 dragon horses stopped in the air. They faced the more than 10 half-immortals in front of them and the cultivators further away. They didn't say anything and just looked at each other from a distance. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to provoke. This was the first visualization of all the cultivators, because they noticed that there was someone in the treasured carriage, but they didn't get off. It was as if they were grooming themselves in front of a mirror. Was it a visitor? What was her origin? She was too arrogant. She dared to act like this in front of more than 10 half-immortals? The half-immortals had their own confidence. Although the 9 dragon horses looked very extraordinary, they didn't really care about them. The only thing they were a little afraid of was that mysterious woman. As for the driver, he was just a nobody. He was automatically excluded from their range of attention. Both sides faced each other awkwardly. It was as if whoever spoke first would lose the initiative. However, the half-immortals had plenty of time. They were experienced and wouldn't be frightened by this inexplicable momentum. To be honest, other than being strange, they really didn't see anything special about the 9 dragon horses, the carriage, and the person. The woman was still putting on her makeup. Her movements were elegant, and her figure was faintly discernible. Even if one couldn't see her face, one could guess that she was definitely a peerless beauty just from her movements. Could it be that the Huangting Taoism was a honey trap, and this carriage was a hollow room? She first applied the powder, then drew her eyebrows, lips, and put on makeup. The woman's movements were very slow, as if she was moving in slow motion. Then, she became somewhat fragmented. Her entire person, including the carriage and the 9 dragon horses, became unreal, as if they were just projections on the surface of the water, and a stone could break the peace and harmony. Not good. The half-immortals were the first to realize the danger, followed by the cultivators who were watching from behind. However, even though they realized the danger, they might not be able to struggle. In just an instant, they felt as if they had fallen into a strange force field. The huge star in front of them also became blurry, as if it was no longer a star, but a huge black hole. The huge suction force made all the cultivators lose control of themselves, and they were all passively sucked in one after another. First, it was the idlers with lower cultivation levels, and then it was the half-immortals' turn. Other than desperately operating their Tao realm to resist, they couldn't even find a target to resist. The BMWs and cars had already disappeared without a trace, and now their opponent had become a real cave image. The cave image that was created out of thin air was pulled in by them powerlessly. No one had entered the cave image before, but they knew that this was it. The abnormally strong radiation filled the entire space. The more they went in, the more intense the suction became, and the cultivators whose cultivation levels were not high enough began to cry out in fear. "It's none of my business. It's none of my business. I'm just here to watch the show." The intensity of the cave image suddenly stopped, because if it continued to intensify, people would die. Obviously, the person controlling the cave image was stuck at this point. A faint voice said, "My master said that the struggle for the Tao fragment depends on each person's ability. But it's not good to bully the weak. You all snatched Zhou Xian's today. Then can I also snatch yours? It's true that the universe is chaotic, but you still have to abide by the rules. This is also related to whether your Tao is upright or not. That's all I have to say. It's up to you whether you want to listen or not. I won't say a second time. So take care of yourselves." Suddenly, it was as if everything had returned to normal. The stars were still hanging high. The 9 horses were still pawing their hooves, and the beauties were still dressing up, as if it was just a nightmare. But everyone knew that it wasn't a nightmare. They were really only one step away from death. The qi and blood in their bodies were surging, Their magic power was greatly damaged, and their Tao realm was in chaos. And all of this was just a heavenly phenomenon casually created by the other party. Because of their low cultivation levels, the idlers only felt fear in their hearts, but they still couldn't see what was really happening. But the half-immortals were much stronger than them. The instant the cave image disappeared and the treasured carriage reappeared, they discovered that the entire carriage was bathed in an extremely soft light. Although it was very short, it was incomparably clear. That light didn't belong to the main world's mortal artifacts. They were completely sure that it was the treasure light of a real immortal artifact. A half-immortal said in fear and trepidation, "I didn't know that a mortal would grace us with your presence." This junior disciple made a fool of himself, and he reaped what he sowed. We will leave immediately and turn over a new leaf, and we will no longer use this method of taking things by force. But, immortal, please leave your name so that we can remind ourselves from time to time. If we have any achievements in the future, we must know which immortal guided us to the right path. There was no reply. The beauties were done with their makeup, and now they started to remove their makeup. Only the driver respectfully brought out a basin of steaming hot water and handed it into the carriage. "Master, the water that you boiled to wash your feet is already done." A cave image was only used to boil a basin of water to wash feet, and it also almost used them as firewood to burn. Everyone was even more terrified. None of them had come into contact with immortals, and they didn't know the temperament of immortals. So who would dare to ask more? Slowly retreating, a half-immortal mustered up his courage, and this time he asked the driver. "Immortal," the driver waved his hand. "I am not some immortal. I am just a driver." The light and shadow peeled off, and the treasured carriage disappeared instantly, disappearing into space. Although the immortal disappeared, the half-immortals didn't dare to go against him in secret. In front of this kind of absolute power, any small trick would be courting death. They were still slowly retreating, as if the immortal had never left. The might of the cave image was really too terrifying. Although it couldn't take their lives for the time being, if it pulled them further in, it would be very mysterious. A half-immortal couldn't help but ask, "Have any of you heard of an immortal who likes to remove makeup?" No one replied, and after a long time, a half-immortal said hesitantly, "I have never heard of an immortal with this habit, but there is one who seems to like to put on skin." Another half-immortal shouted, "Quickly leave. Chattering nonsense. You dare to say anything. Don't you want to live?" Chapter 2348. In the sky, two figures were laughing as they hurried on their way. Xia Bingji turned her head to look at the sloppy guy beside her. "Little E, you lied to me again. I'm afraid this carriage is not an ordinary thing. You said it was a gift from a friend. I think you're robbing an immortal." "Little E, it can't be true, right?" Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "Wife, other than a sword, everything else on your man is a gift from a friend. It's been like this since I built my foundation. Who asked me to have so many friends? As for the carriage, it should be an immortal item, but it might also be a defective immortal item. A friend of mine who does business in the immortal world gave it to me. Later on, this friend met with an accident." Xia Bingji was speechless. "Nonsense. You have so many friends, especially Dafa. He would rather die than leave his things to you. From foundation establishment to half-immortal. Why haven't I met a friend like this?" The carriage was Yangdi's. It was the one he and Cheng Lu Sheng tore apart in Winged Sky. This guy had a pile of immortal items in his pocket, but he couldn't self-destruct because he couldn't destroy immortal items as a half-immortal. So Lu Xiaoyi benefited from it. Of course, it was useless to him. So what if Yang Di had a body full of treasures? In the hands of the swordsman, he didn't even have a chance to use them. The important thing is still the person. If you don't understand this point, don't ever go to the top of the pyramid. So, ugly people are always more popular than beautiful people. Because people who are with me feel superior, I have a lot of friends. Wife, you can't do it. No matter who you stand with, they will all be compared to Ugly Duckling, who would be willing to be your friend. But it doesn't matter. What's mine is yours. There are a lot of immortal items. There will be more in the future. I'm just afraid that you will be blind in the end. Xiao Bingji curled her lips. I don't care. She was really speechless. The heavenly Tao was like this. The more one didn't care about the items, the more the heavenly Tao would stuff them into their hands. The more one needed something, the more stingy it would be. So weird. If you want to fight, then fight. Why do you have to resort to such crooked methods? Why do you still want to put on makeup? I won't listen to you in the future. If this gets out, I'll be embarrassed to death. Lu Xiaoyi laughed heartily. This is a kind of psychological cue. That's how it's written in novels. If we don't do this, won't our future biographies be dry? Letting Xia Bingji dress up in the carriage was just a smokescreen. With her in front, no one would think that this matter had something to do with him, which would save a lot of trouble. Of course, no one would suspect Xia Bingji. How could a young spirit supreme have such an ability? The focus was on the dead star. It was the key to Lu Xiaoyi activating the phenomenon realm. A black hole, in terms of physics, was formed by the collapse of a star. Of course, not every star that had finished burning would end up like this. Only a very small number of them needed various conditions to coincide. Lu Xiaoyi relied on the essence of this star to successfully create the phenomenon realm. However, his ability was limited for the time being. If he really wanted to use this realm to kill people, he might be able to kill those supremes, but it was beyond the power of half-immortals. In the end, he still had to use the flying sword. But if it was a threat, then it was just right. For pretending to be an immortal, it was inappropriate to kill people. The layer of light on the carriage was the natural self-protection of the immortal artifact when it encountered danger. As a result, the half-immortals who lost half of their souls were even more convinced that the person sitting in the carriage was a real immortal. It could be considered an unintentional act. In short, this matter was handled satisfactorily. No blood was spilled, and those who had bad intentions were scared away. For a long time in the future, the vicinity of Zhou would be safe because of those idle people who liked to spread the news. The key was that they didn't expose themselves. This allowed the two of them to continue their carefree and happy journey. Lu Xiaoyi's desire to fight with half-immortals was really dull. He had already set his sights on a higher level because he was very clear that as the new era got closer and closer, not to mention his impersonation, even the whereabouts of real immortals would appear in the origin world. That would be the start of the real test. The journey was leisurely and leisurely. He devoted himself to the void of the universe and did not pursue speed. Along the way, when he saw a celestial phenomenon that interested Xia Bingji, he would go and take a look. This process made him very surprised. I say, wife, how did you reach this realm? I see that you rarely travel in the void. Xia Bingji lightly smiled. What? Is there definitely no way out if I stay in the domain to cultivate? Must I come to the void of the universe to fight to the death? Like you, I go everywhere to make friends. I don't have many opportunities to come out. Huangting Taoism can be considered rich in resources, so it seems that I don't need to rush about outside. The universe is as big as the heart. Little e, your universe is different from mine. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. No wonder people are envious of you. Sitting at home, the Tao comes from the sky. That's what you're talking about, right? I can't do it. If I sit for too long, the only thing that falls is a brick. Xia Bingji sweetly smiled. But I also have my limitations. For example, I can't fight, I can't compete, I can't establish my Tao. I can be satisfied with this situation, but you can't. Lu Xiaoyi laughed heartily. The so-called cultivation still depends on longevity. Chapter 2349. P.S. Looking for guaranteed monthly votes. Everyone has the right to choose their own life, the one that suits them the most. The key is to support each other and not force your own things on others, even if you have good intentions. Therefore, although Lu Xiaoyi had a lot of celestial artifacts, he didn't give them all to his woman. Why should he give them? Without these celestial artifacts and treasures, She also cultivated from foundation establishment Jin Dan to sun god true lord. She was also living well, with a firm goal and unswerving determination. Yang Xiaohua had a lot of celestial artifacts, but what happened? Therefore, he only picked one or two of the strongest defensive celestial artifacts that could protect one's life, and gave them to her half forcibly. Cultivation was such a fantasy. He had so many good things but couldn't give them away. Friends had their own pride, swordsmen had their own path, and his wife, could he give her a lot of celestial artifacts to cultivate her desire for battle? He had one or two defensive treasures. As for killing people, what treasure was more domineering and sharp than his sword talisman? Cultivators and Tao companions were different from mortals. The most important thing was to maintain each other's independence in cultivation. This was something that had been proven. Just like Escort Lu's current achievements, just like Xia Bingji, who had silently kept up with his pace, didn't seem to be left far behind. In her line of sight, a huge object slowly appeared. Xia Bingji looked at it silently and nodded. Little E, you're right. This domain is too big. It's impossible to survive in the various gravitational forces of the main world. I estimate that even if it doesn't collapse when the space fuses, it will still attract a large number of celestial bodies in a short period of time, which will cause it to expand too quickly and collapse. Lu Xiaoyi gave a thumbs up. My wife is so knowledgeable. Even I didn't think of what you said. Xia Bingji rolled her eyes at him. She thought that he was used to flattering her, but in fact, Lu Xiaoyi really wasn't flattering her this time. It was the first time he heard such an opinion. The formation of Heaven's Choice Continent was a process of constantly attracting celestial bodies from the negative space to strengthen and expand itself. However, the premise was that the number of celestial bodies in the negative space was countless levels lower than that of the main world, almost negligible. Over a long period of time, relatively few celestial bodies were absorbed, giving the Heaven's Choice Continent time to strengthen itself. However, it was different in the origin world. There were countless stars, and as long as a colossus like the Heaven's Choice Continent appeared, it would immediately attract countless stars. In a short period of time, a large number of stars would surpass the digestive ability of the Heaven's Choice Continent. The internal structure of the Heaven's Choice Continent was already a mess. Under such pressure, there was no other possibility other than collapse. Although it was Xia Bingji's first time seeing Heaven's Choice, her analysis was still accurate. This was also the characteristic of cultivators like her. In short, no one was omnipotent, and no one could be ignored. Everyone had their own value. It was close to Heaven's selection, and it was a scene of prosperity. It almost included all the forms of cultivation before the arrival of the new era. There were outsiders who traveled thousands of miles to experience the last chance of the Tao tablets. There were aboriginals who brought their families to the origin world to start a new life. There were people who traveled in an endless stream to seize the last chance to do business. Of course, there were also people who were here to fish in troubled waters, hoping to take advantage of the chaos to make a profit. The good and evil of human nature had been expanded to the extreme in this chaotic world, especially in a place like the Heaven's Choice Continent. The last madness, Lu Xiaoyi said firmly. They're just a small madness. There is still some big madness in this world. After bewitching everyone, he ran to the bottom of someone else's lake to steal their beauty. Xia Bingji snorted. Lu Xiaoyi laughed loudly. The two of them joined hands and merged into the chaotic current. Regardless of whether it was madness or not, the current cultivation world had a trace of a true cultivation world. Rushing figures. Everyone had their own goals. Cultivation was uncertain. The great Tao was uncertain, and the future was uncertain. It was precisely because there were so many uncertainties that cultivation was filled with hope. This was what he had been striving for all along. Xia Bingji covered her face with a veil, and Lu Xiaoyi changed his appearance. Just like all the cultivators who came and went in a hurry, they were able to throw themselves into this great era of revolution. Just this point alone, they were all lucky. The Heaven's Choice continent no longer had any restrictions on entering or exiting. It was completely open and not intentionally done by the higher-ups of the Heaven's Choice continent. It was a choice they had no choice but to make in this great era. It was once a colossus, the #1 realm in the Origin World that made the Origin World's cultivation world fearful. It was once a huge power that suppressed Zhou Xian in the Origin World. In just 1 or 2,000 years, its image as a whole could no longer be seen. The appearance of the Hung River boundary allowed the Heaven's Choice continent's large sects to have a realistic and long-term foundation. It was inevitable that the next step would be the transfer of power, resources, and talents. The huge Hung River boundary, under the erosion of the even bigger Heaven's Choice continent, was no longer the Hung River boundary of the past. In the foreseeable future, it would definitely become a member of the Origin World's orthodoxy. Those so-called legends, culture, and traditions, nothing could resist this kind of pervasive erosion. The large powers had their own places to go, and the small sects had their own thoughts. When returning to the Origin World became mainstream, the Heaven's Choice continent would definitely become a thing of the past. The current situation was that it was chaotic and disorderly, because there was no longer the power of the Origin World to maintain the order that would no longer exist. As a whole, the people's hearts were scattered. It's a very beautiful place, unbelievably big. It's just that it's a bit messy. Xiao Bingji sighed. Actually, there were still many things that she wasn't willing to touch on. If the Heaven's Choice continent really collapsed, the hundreds of billions of mortals and countless low-level cultivators here wouldn't be able to rely on themselves to resist the threat from the new era. Then where would they go? If it really collapsed, how many pieces would it collapse into? Dozens of pieces? Would each piece have its own atmosphere? Would they all be suitable for human survival? If not, what could cultivators do in it? Little E, you self-proclaimed pioneers of the new era. If you have the time to set up your Tao in the land of the Yellow Dragon to gain attention, why don't you think of doing something practical here, something within your capabilities? With hundreds of billions of people here, even the slightest change in the boundary will cause countless deaths and injuries. The smallest unit will be calculated in hundreds of millions. I was thinking that if someone could solve this problem, then no matter what Tao he set up, he would definitely succeed. Unfortunately, I don't have such ability. Looking at Lu Xiaoyi, her eyes were clear. But you do. You definitely do. You still have a lot of friends. If no one comes to do this, will you do it? Lu Xiaoyi didn't expect that a simple trip with a beauty would actually bring him such a thorny problem. Was this woman too emotional? Or too weak? Didn't she know that even the change of dynasties in the mortal world required the sacrifice of countless people, no matter if you were active or passive? Could it be easily brushed aside by saying that the merciful don't command troops and the benevolent don't change laws? He held the woman's hand. If no one comes to do it, then I will. Chapter 2350. One had to admit that Xia Bingji's worries were not groundless. She might have raised a difficult problem that no one was willing to face directly, but from another perspective, she might have raised a new direction for the Tao unification stage. The establishment of the Tao should be like a group of male peacocks, competing to see whose but was prettier in front of the heavenly Tao, whose hair was brighter. When the epoch changed, there would be changes in the universe's astronomical phenomena. This was the conclusion. In the four-symbol sky, there were countless astronomical phenomena that were changing. This was something that every cultivator could feel. There would also be changes on the planets that humans could live on, but they were much smaller in comparison. This was because when humans chose to live on a planet, they would not choose a planet that was chaotic and had an unstable structure like a volcano. This was the principle. The changes in the astronomical phenomena mainly occurred on planets that were originally in the last phase or were unstable to begin with. This was a process that accelerated and intensified. Under this judgment, when the new epoch truly began, most of the human domains in the main world would be fine, so there was no need to talk about how to protect them. Unless the universe was destroyed and restarted, that would be a different matter. However, the Heaven's Choice continent was a special case. Lu Xiaoyi was busy with his own matters and rarely considered this problem. He came to the Heaven's Choice continent for the sword Dao Steel, not to save the common people. However, Xia Bingji was meticulous. From an outsider's point of view, the battle for the establishment of the Dao was not important to her. What was important was the possible trauma left behind by the changes in the universe. This was not anyone's fault. It was the process of nature. Such deaths and injuries had never stopped during the changes in the universe. It was just a small loss. However, it was also the fault of all cultivators. Perhaps starting from Li Wuya, the Tao Lord of Destiny, and others, and now including Lu Xiaoyi and all the other cultivators who pushed this process forward. This was because the change in the epoch was because the order of the universe could not keep up with the development of the cultivators. How to deal with the Heaven's Choice continent was a huge problem. Lu Xiaoyi had no clue about this. The population of hundreds of billions was unimaginable. Just the population of the Fifth Ring world alone was enough to make him badly battered. In the end, he did not dare to migrate to the stars, let alone here. Wife, is this a test for me after my second marriage? Xia Bingji glared fiercely at him. Whose second marriage? You're the one getting married for the second time. Lu Xiaoyi quibbled. The first marriage is in the rust zone. The second marriage is in the yellow court. 2,000 years have passed, and the air of lethargy is still growing. Walking the path of the heavens with a beauty, sighing at the fate of the common people. Originally a free and unfettered Rome, but now a mountain on his back. Wife, this is so difficult. I've always believed that as long as we're together, there's nothing we can't think of. But in this case, no matter how you think about it, it's all in vain. Xia Bingji couldn't be annoyed. She admired this person's ability to perfectly combine serious and frivolous matters and express them naturally and fluently. The best way was to pretend that he couldn't tell and only listen to what he wanted to hear. Migration is impossible. There were hundreds of billions of people, but there was no place to settle them, even if they were scattered. Transportation was difficult, and it was difficult to leave one's homeland. Integration was a long way off, and there were all kinds of strange requirements. Just transportation alone. How many people could survive to their destination? It was also impossible to maintain the status of a five-ring soul master. Even if Heaven's Choice didn't collapse during the fusion of the positive and negative spaces, it would definitely collapse after coexisting in the same world. Tell me, why did Heaven's Choice make Heaven's Choice so big? Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. Only heaven knows the answer to this question. But your last sentence is a train of thought. The only feasible method is, before Heaven's Choice collapses, let's collapse it first. Xia Bingji opened her mouth in surprise. But thinking about it carefully, this was indeed a feasible method. If Heaven's Choice was divided into tens or hundreds of small realms, after such a volume was integrated into the main world, there would naturally be no need to worry about being unable to bear the pressure due to its volume being too big. It was just that there were too many problems to consider. Too many, so many that she didn't know where to start. She felt a little guilty. Xiaoyi, did I cause you trouble? At such a time, everyone is establishing their Tao. But because of me, you put your attention on Heaven's Choice of common people? Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand heroically. No matter. How big a matter is it? I can collapse it with just a fart. Later, let me eat radishes for a year first. Xia Bingji pinched him. Can you be more serious? You didn't even say 3 sentences and ran down. Lu Xiaoyi hugged her waist. He felt that she seemed to be slightly fuller than when she was in the yellow court. He knew that this woman had given up on her insistence on a certain concept and catered to him. His heart moved. Indeed, you have caused me trouble. But this kind of trouble can also be the trouble of happiness, the trouble that is closer to my ideal. You also know that my thoughts may be a little too much. Then why would heaven comply with my wishes? I have to be different from the rest. Everyone is squeezed into the land of the yellow dragon to establish their Tao. Even if I am in the Tao realm, no matter how marvelous I am I'm only slightly better than them. I need something that is completely different from the others. All these years, I have been searching for how to make myself more favored by the heavenly Tao than others. I haven't found it, but today I found it. So you're my lucky star. Xia Bingji felt a little sweet in her heart. She said softly, "You only know how to say nice things. Who knows how many senior sisters you have tricked with this?" Lu Xiaoyi sighed in his heart. He was a self-proclaimed flower sage, but in this aspect he was actually a green melon egg. If he had understood this earlier, wouldn't he have been much happier in these 2,000 years? As for spending money to hunt for food everywhere, the two of them held hands and slowly flew on the Heaven's Choice continent. In this fickle era, there were very few people like them who still had the mood to enjoy the scenery. Even for those who were calm, when you saw the people around you thinking of ways to curry favor, selling houses and land to accumulate resources in preparation for a long journey, under this kind of atmosphere, how many people could really remain calm? The foreign cultivators wouldn't think so much, because no matter where they went, they would have a home in their hearts. But the people of Heaven's Choice didn't. Whether this continent still existed or not, it might be revealed in another 1 or 2,000 years. They were the ones who felt the most direct threat to their survival, or were they living under someone else's roof and drifting around? Lu Xiaoyi couldn't empathize with this kind of feeling. He thought that he was doing great things, but now with Xia Bingji's reminder, he finally realized this point. He should do something for these people, not only because all of this might have been fueled by the sword vein, but also because he wanted to be the leader of this trend, the founder of order. He couldn't be like the majority of people and think that all of this had nothing to do with him. A higher position, a greater ambition, and a heavier responsibility. It was a challenge, but also an opportunity. Chapter 2351. On Heaven's Choice Continent, Lu Xiaoyi didn't have many acquaintances. In the past, there were, but with the current situation of Heaven's Choice Continent, who knew where everyone went? The entire continent had been abandoned and turned into a free paradise. There was no point in looking for traces of old friends. They just wandered in the skies of Heaven's Choice Continent. When they encountered scenery or culture, they would go down to take a look. There were also local delicacies. Forget about the beauties. The people around them were closely guarded. Xia Bingji wasn't interested in the remaining 10 or so innate Dao tablets. Actually, as long as she wanted to go in, Lu Xiaoyi would definitely have a way to help her. But in this aspect, women had their own persistence. Just do what you like to do. Why do you have to look up to a higher mountain? Or is it destined to become a Dao of the past? In the entire Heaven's Choice continent, the only ones that could still maintain order were these countries that were lucky enough to have Dao tablets. It wasn't that they had a sense of responsibility, but that they were desperately trying to gather resources and spiritual opportunity through their Dao tablets. This was the last chance. Once the Dao collapsed, there would be no more chances. This kind of wandering was quite interesting in the beginning, but after a few months, it became boring. But Xia Bingji still persisted. Lu Xiaoyi advised her, "Wife, you don't have to give yourself such a burden. There are many people who are worried about the fate of Heaven's Choice continent. You aren't the only one. In theory, there are at least tens of thousands of people who are more responsible than you. Why do you have to suffer? I know what you mean by wandering around Heaven's Choice. You are thinking about how to divide Heaven's Choice continent in terms of geography, race, country, etc. How to pay the smallest price. This is very difficult. Including me, it is very difficult to see the weakness of Heaven's Choice continent's crust. Where is the easiest way to divide it? If you consider the factors you saw, this is as difficult as asking me to release a piece of music. Leave it all to me, okay?" Xia Bingji said faintly, "I may not have the ability, nor the obligation, but I am the one who proposed this idea to the person who is most likely to solve it. So, even if I have nothing to do with this, my thoughts will affect this continent more than others, right?" Lu Xiaoyi nodded. "That makes sense. Why don't we think about it tonight? You can draw a sketch on the map of the Heaven's Choice continent. No matter if it's a flower or something else. I'll just follow that sketch in the future." Xia Bingji sighed. I've been thinking about it all the way. Little E, can we relax sometimes and not think about it? Lu Xiaoyi disagreed. Thinking about it is the best way to relax. Waves of spiritual vigor could be felt from the front of their flight. That was the sign of a battle. The two of them sighed and took a detour. Similar disputes happened every day and every hour. There was no other way but to avoid them. Lu Xiaoyi looked at the woman who wanted to speak but stopped on second thought. This time he spoke first. This is not something we should care about. For example, they could set up some sort of organization in Heaven's Choice. Once they entered the cultivation world, life and death depended on themselves. There was nothing to complain about. They couldn't do anything about it, because their hearts were in a mess. The more they care, the worse it gets. Such a situation didn't exist in Zhou because they had a home to protect. No matter what the new era was, home was their home. It didn't exist in the fifth ring either, because they had set their sights on the universe. The millions of years of history of the Heaven's Choice continent proved that this way of cultivation development was wrong. Even if they had persevered for such a long time, once something big happened, they would immediately scatter. Separated for a long time, united for a long time, divided for a long time. The larger the size, the harder it was to control. It was the same for the world and the crowd. There would always be an upper limit. After such a long time, they finally arrived at the Sword Dao Steel. What surprised them was that there were also many people in front of the Sword Dao Steel. In fact, there were no fewer people than the innate Dao Steel. The only difference was that there weren't many people with high realms here. Most of them were Jin Dan and Yuanying. Wife, I might have to go in for a while. It's hard to say how long. You're alone outside, Xiao Bingji smiled. Little E, do you think I'm a child? I'm also a sun god. If it weren't for you half-immortals coming down to make trouble, I would be the ruler of the cultivation world of the main world. Didn't we agree a long time ago? You enter the Sword Dao Steel, and I'll stay outside for a while. After I'm done, I'll return to Zhou Xian. Do I really need you to escort me? Even in Heaven's Choice, I'm not completely without support. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. Oh, then I really didn't know that you, who have never come to Heaven's Choice, have friends here? Seeing Xia Bingji smile without saying anything, he couldn't help but slap his forehead. Understand, it's your Kuan Dao organization again, right? It's really amazing that they've developed to this point. Good, with these friends here, Heaven's Choice can go. If there's a chance that you can't ask for help, just keep flying north. That place used to be the territory of the ancient fierce beasts. They're all my old friends. With just a word, it won't be a problem to destroy a few so-called upper countries. Xia Bingji didn't act like a woman. She smiled sweetly and floated away. Children of cultivation didn't have so many sorrows about parting. Just as she said, as a sun god supreme, if she's still worried about her own safety here, then her thousands of years of cultivation would have been in vain. This was the agreement between the two of them. They would break up here, and after that, it would depend on fate. After being together for so many years, the two of them were actually very clear about each other's situation. Needless to say, Lu Xiaoyi had a lot of big and small things to deal with. Xia Bingji also needed her own time to complete this step. This was the reason why they were called Taoist companions in the cultivation world and not husband and wife. Independent personality, independent thinking, and independent cultivation. It wasn't about who was protecting who. For the two of them, in fact, in the depths of their hearts, they had found a shelter for themselves. Even if they didn't get together much, they could give each other spiritual comfort, and that was enough. Looking at the woman leaving in such a carefree manner, he couldn't help but smile. This woman used such actions to tell him not to be immersed in love. He turned around and slowly flew to the Sword Dao Steel. There were also many swordsmen gathered outside the Sword Dao Steel. They were discussing and arguing with each other, and even gesturing. This was also a major characteristic of swordsmen. Someone laughed loudly at him. Brother, you practice the sword especially with a woman. You're really free and easy. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and nodded. How many years had it been since such a familiar scene? More than 2,000 years? Or less? In the past, hundreds of swordsmen swaggered by here every day, causing countless bad comments. Now that he thought about it, it was like yesterday. The Willow Sea was still the same, and the Tao Steel was still the same, but that feeling could never be found again. The former Sword Soldier army was formed here, and it shone brightly in the later Universe War. However, things changed with the passage of time. After all, cultivation was not an army. How many sword soldiers were still alive? You could count them with 2 hands. Chapter 2352. Lu Xiaoyi could not help but feel melancholy. He was very clear that there would be many more such melancholy in the future, and it would accompany him for the rest of his life, until his death. He greeted every swordsman who cast a kind gaze at him. At this moment, he was no longer a demigod, but an ordinary swordsman. After the 2 universe wars, the Xianyuan swordsmen in the Dome had created a trend of observing the sword Tao Steel in the Heaven's Choice continent. But to be honest, only a few could actually make it here. The distance was too far. If you were not a demigod and did not have the inner and outer scenic skies as a springboard, it was impossible to make it here with your physical body. On this point, Lu Xiaoyi did not provide them with any help. The reason why Li Wuya placed the sword Tao Steel here was actually to set up an artificial threshold. If one could not reach this place by flying, it meant that one's realm was not high enough. It would be a waste to come here. It was better to stay in the Dome and study the Xianyuan scabbard swordsmanship. Spoiling things by excessive enthusiasm and biting off more than one could chew were taboo for cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi would of course not provide such convenience to anyone. Those who could stay here were mostly swordsmen from the Heaven's Choice continent. There were also some who came from a nearby sword vein, such as Zhou Xian. There was no need to differentiate them one by one. When he arrived in front of the sword Tao Steel, he could still feel that unconcealable sharpness. It was so familiar, so intimate, as if this aura had always been by his side and had never left. Li Wuya, I'm back. This time, let me see how much difference there is between us. Then, I'll have to wipe your ass. I'm afraid I won't be able to come here before the new era. With a crash, he was already in another space. Before he crashed in, he did not think too much. But at the same time, hundreds of swordsmen were ejected by the sword Tao Steel. No matter what you were doing inside, even if you were passing the test, it was the same. The sudden change left everyone dumbfounded. They couldn't understand why the sword Tao tablet had suddenly gone crazy. Was this the prelude to his collapse? In the Heaven's Choice mainland, there were close to 10,000 big and small countries, which also meant that there were close to 10,000 innate and postnatal Tao tablets. Following the collapse of 20 innate Taos, the postnatal Taos that were attached to them also ceased to exist. With the collapse of the foundation, how could they continue to exist? Every Tao Steel would be like this before it collapsed. All of the cultivators inside would be ejected. Then, the Tao Steels would glow with Tao light and return to the heavenly Tao, waiting to be reforged. The hundreds of sword cultivators outside looked as if they had lost their parents. There were even some sword cultivators who were beating their chests and stamping their feet, deeply lamenting their bad luck. Why did they encounter such an unlucky time? However, there were also those who were clear-headed. A true monarch was very puzzled. This shouldn't be. Normally, the collapse of the postnatal Taos would occur at the same time as the collapse of the innate Taos. However, the innate Taos of 3 virtues had been collapsing for over a decade now. So, why did the sword Tao Steel collapse only now? Furthermore, the innate Tao of the 3 virtues was related to the sword Tao. This was sword ancestor Li's morality, right? I've never heard of St. Bedford's virtues being related to the sword Tao. His question was actually the same as all of the other swordsmen. Regardless of the time of collapse or the karmic connection between the two, there was no reason for the sword Tao Steel to collapse now. However, a Jindan cultivator in the crowd asked his companions, I just saw a swordsman go in. Why didn't he come out? Did he die inside? Or did he leave happily? His eyes were very crafty, but because his cultivation was too low, no one listened to him. What was there to pay attention to an ordinary swordsman? Because of this, they missed out on a very important person. A person who was almost on par with sword ancestor Li in the current sword vein. However, no one left. As swordsmen, they were born with strong willpower. Even if their own Tao steel was collapsing, they still had the ability to bear witness to it. Unfortunately, sword ancestor Li's unparalleled sword technique was about to be lost and could never be replicated again. However, they were the witnesses of this tragedy. Witnesses. Lu Xiaoyi immediately realized what was happening, but he was too late to stop it. This was Li Wuya's Tao steel. Obviously, the Tao steel was very mystical. It had already realized who had entered. This was the space of the Tao steel. It was gray and hazy, and only the 9 realms hung high in the sky. They were the Foundation Realm, Advanced Realm, Green Netherworld Realm, Unparalleled Realm, Game Realm, Tri-Birth Realm, Tao Realm, Celestial Phenomenon Realm, and Sword Disciple Realm. The Foundation Stage was the Foundation Stage. The Advanced Stage was the Jin Dan Stage. The Green Darkness Stage was the Yuanying Stage. The Traversing Stage was the Vertical Sword Stage. The Bow Stage was the Bright Sword Stage. The Triple Birth Stage was the Severing Triple Birth Stage. The Tao Stage was Li Wuya's own Tao Sword Stage. And the Celestial Phenomenon Stage was Li Wuya's most famous Celestial Phenomenon swordsmanship. He had entered the sword steel twice before, and it was not long ago. In fact, it could be said that he had entered once. From the perspective of breaking through the stages, he had already passed the first 6 stages. He only had the last 3 stages, which he called the Great 3 Stages, that he had yet to pass. The last stage was when he was defeated by Golden Origin in the Celestial Phenomenon stage, which was a little embarrassing. In fact, among the Great 3 Stages, he had already achieved his goal in the Tao stage. At that time, he had comprehended his first faith, independence. So to be precise, he had already passed the stage. So now, should he kill Li Wuya to prove himself again? He chose not to. He was not such a shallow person that he would be complacent just because he had killed Li Wuya's sword spirit. He was sure that with his current ability, he could easily crush Li Wuya when he entered the Tao sword stage. But this could not prove anything. At his current level, he had long since understood some things. Moreover, he was now at the peak of his power. To deal with a sword spirit that had limited his ability, and whose way of thinking was not that of a normal human cultivator, such a victory was meaningless. He, Lu Xiaoyi, could not afford a lose face like this. No matter how powerful Li Wuya had been at that time, it was not him in the sword steel. So how could he, a spiritual master, be compared with his sword spirit? This was not equal at all. Sword spirits did not have intelligence. No matter how exquisite the sword technique was, it was something that Li Wuya had bestowed upon it. It could not create its own. This was the fundamental reason. Thus, he had entered the sword steel now for only 2 real purposes. He wanted to challenge and learn the astronomical sword technique, and then go to the sword disciple level to see how much of a gap there was between the senior who had already been at the 2nd severance and himself now at the 1st severance. Astronomical phenomena was Li Wuya's specialty. He had also mentioned it in his autobiography. For this, he had observed over 1,000 special astronomical phenomena and finally managed to gather over a dozen moves. He had not done it half-heartedly, nor had he made up the numbers. Lu Xiaoyi did not focus solely on the celestial phenomenon. His focus was on the 36 innate Taos. However, the path of Taos was different, and all paths led to the same destination. In fact, when they reached the final step, they realized that the celestial phenomenon was the external manifestation of the Taos, and the Taos were the internal manifestation of the celestial phenomenon. What made Lu Xiaoyi curious was, did Li Wuya's astronomical sword technique have anything to do with astronomical phenomena? If so, who was superior in comparison to his? Chapter 2353. P.S. Today is a good day. Uncle loves to travel and has added a little jacket. Uncle won't be able to travel in the future. Lu Xiaoyi stepped into the heavenly phenomenon tier without hesitation. The last time he came here, he didn't see anything. He only felt that with himself, as the center, there was a vast and majestic golden halo. It was a little like the center of a nuclear explosion in his previous life. He didn't even try to resist. Under such power, no matter what he did, it would be meaningless and futile. But he could know the name of this sword technique through Crow ancestors' consciousness, Golden Origin. This time, it was still Golden Origin, but he was no longer the original him. As soon as the golden halo appeared, he had already accurately determined the Tao state composition of the Golden Origin. It was similar to his conjecture. He had also used it once in the interior realm, so he knew how to crack it. The only difference was the order of the Tao level, the emphasis, the combination, and the way to break through. He had to admit that he couldn't reach Li Wuya's level in terms of killing. This was because of his personality and not because of his ability. With an accurate understanding, he naturally had a way to deal with it. His Tao level changed rapidly, and every change was targeted at Golden Origin's Tao level rotation. In this aspect, he wasn't inferior to Li Wuya at all. In fact, he was even superior. In less than a breath, the entire Golden Origin was completely restricted by him, unable to unleash that extremely powerful, explosive power. But he didn't do it perfectly, because Li Wuya's cultivation was far above his. So, he was still hit by the weakened Golden Origin. Under the powerful impact, he couldn't stop himself from retreating, almost unable to control his own body. This was the difference between the second severance and the first severance. It was a distance that he couldn't solve at present. However, he wasn't knocked out of the gate, because his body had been modified with 3 holes in one body. The gate tacitly acknowledged that he was qualified to defend against Golden Origin. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. The facts proved that he already had the ability to resist the heavenly phenomenon sword technique. And this was only in a situation where he was purely defending. He hadn't used all his techniques yet. Next, the mysterious heavenly phenomenon sword technique that was passed down in the cultivation world was unveiled in front of him. Eye of the heavenly Tao, light of life, Mjolnir, judgment of light, judgment of darkness, planetary storm, meteor tide, twin spiral entanglement. Different celestial phenomena were displayed through the combination of different Tao realms. In terms of intricate transformations, they were inferior to him, but in terms of savagery, they were superior to him. This was his true experience in the perilous waves of the celestial phenomenon sword art. An interesting discovery was that there were no cave images. He wondered why the Crow ancestor did not create any cave images despite reading all the astronomical phenomena in the universe. From beginning to end, he had not been struck out. Instead, he relied on his superior Tao realm ability to control the progress of the battle. After gradually adapting to it, he began to counterattack and easily obtained the initiative of the battle. This was also a process that tested the quality of his combination of Tao realms. In this space, no one could be seen anymore, but it was like a miniature version of an incomparably gorgeous and colorful fantasy universe, demonstrating the generation and suppression of the great Tao and the complexity and variability of the universe's development. This change changed Lu Xiaoyi for 10 years. 10 years later, Lu Xiaoyi took the initiative to withdraw. He only felt that Jian Ying's beard and hair were standing on end in the Tao realm space, as if he was regretful that the outcome of the battle could not be determined. He did not defeat Li Wuya, not because he could not, but because he did not want to. This was the respect for his seniors, and also the strictness for himself. Even if he killed Jianing under such circumstances, it would not prove anything. He could kill Jianing, but if he had the chance to face Li Wuya face to face, would he be able to kill him? In a battle between experts, there were some moves that could not be used too many times. A true expert would change his strategy after seeing that it was ineffective. How could he observe it over and over again to find a way to break it? Just like the Golden Origin, he was sure that the Golden Origin that Li Wuya used was definitely different from Jian Ying's. 100 times, there would be 100 different versions. This was the true ability of a swordsman with a soul. Therefore, he had to distinguish between the two, which was a sign of his lack of class. He had already proven that his ability was not inferior to Li Wuya's at the same level. That was enough. The celestial swordsmanship was just another way to describe the Tao realm swordsmanship. It was similar, but different paths led to the same goal. Li Wuya used the celestial swordsmanship to understand the Tao realm, while he used the Tao realm to derive the celestial swordsmanship. How could there be a difference? Standing in the sword-steel space, Lu Xiaoyi slowly reflected on his gains in the past 10 years. The most important thing was how to convert the Tao realm into the ability to kill. When a cultivator reached the level of a true monarch, everyone would have some achievements in one or a few Tao realms. However, when it came to a battle, everyone's strength differed greatly. The reason was that different cultivators had different cultivation philosophies, and their application of the Tao realm differed greatly. Some people like to use the Tao realm to refine pills, some to draw talismans, some to set up formations, some to create weapons, and some to do nothing at all. They just let nature take its course. Of course, it was more or less reflected in the battle. However, professional battles and occasional battles were two different concepts. Thus, there was a huge difference in the battle capabilities of each person. Swordsmen focused more on fighting in this aspect and did not do things like cultivating one's character. Lu Xiaoyi belonged to the category that focused more on the transformation of the Tao realm into battle. Li Wuya was even more extreme. Everything he did was to cultivate for battle, for killing. If a swordsman could convert the Tao realm into battle strength, an ordinary person could convert 50% or 60%. Lu Xiaoyi could already do 80% or 90%. However, Li Wuya could convert 10% of the Tao realm into 11% of battle strength. This was the real reason why Li Wuya was invincible in the past. He was a natural-born killer. Lu Xiaoyi had also found his own weakness. How could he improve his battle strength to the next level? After entering the sword steel, the most important thing was to make a comparison and improve himself, not to kill the sword shadow left behind by a historical figure. He was not so shallow that he needed such a meaningless victory to boost his self-confidence. In these 10 years, no one had been able to enter the sword steel. He more or less understood the reason. Because the battle between the heavenly phenomenon realm cultivators had already occupied all the energy of the sword steel, and it could no longer accommodate the existence of others. Unless he went out himself, no one else could enter. It was a little selfish, but there was nothing he could do about it. After all, he was Xuanyuan's direct disciple. No reward. Lu Xiaoyi looked at the huge word in amusement. It had once brought him endless joy. Then, he took a deep breath and stepped into the 9th realm of the sword steel, the sword disciple stage. Chapter 2354. Outside the Sword Dao tablet, everyone grew more anxious as they waited. They all realized that something was amiss. The Sword Dao tablet actually lasted for another 10 years after ejecting everyone, and who knew how many years it would last? This was the first time they had experienced such a situation. They had never heard of any other Dao tablet before. Was it going to collapse or not? If it didn't collapse, it wouldn't even allow people to enter to investigate. This was rather depressing. There were all sorts of guesses that came from the collective wisdom of the swordsman. Is this a temporary maintenance? An upgrade? Maybe there's a prize event? Do you still remember the big word prize? It has never been lit up. Is it because the prize pool is full and they're going easy on us? This was the optimist. Most of them were still realistic. Sword Ancestor Li's Sword Dao tablet is resisting the oppression of the heavenly Dao. If the heavens want me to collapse, I will not. This is also the spirit of the Sword Dao. Isn't this too tiring? Maybe it has nothing to do with the 3 virtues Dao. Maybe it came from very far away. Our Sorvain's Dao tablet doesn't seem to be directly related to any innate Dao. The Sword Dao is unyielding. Shouldn't it only collapse at the last moment of the new era? Why is it that it can't hold on before the dozen or so great Taoists collapse? There are all sorts of opinions. There was no accurate source of information. It seemed like there was no other way other than to wait. However, the strongest true monarch felt the tablet, and his expression changed. I feel that the tablet has not been peaceful for the past 10 years. It's as if there's some kind of power raging inside. I'm suspicious. We're all thinking about Taos. Could it be that it has nothing to do with Taos? Could be caused by someone who went in and caused such a result. That Jean Dan was very hurt. I told you 10 years ago that the Sword Tao tablet only ejected one person. You just didn't believe me. You could still find out at that time. But now, 10 years have passed. With so many people coming and going, how can you find out? A funny scene appeared on the Willow Sea Sword Tao Steel. Hundreds of swordsmen couldn't enter the Tao Steel, but they couldn't figure out what was going on inside. Thus, they stuck themselves to the outer walls of the Tao Steel and tried to sense the changes inside. It was like a swarm of flies biting onto rotten meat. Above the Sword Tao Steel, a figure smiled as he looked at the comical scene below. Beside him was an ugly snake with one head and two bodies. Senior brothers inside. So of course these fellows have to come out obediently. Can they afford to stay inside and rub their heads against you? Sister-in-law, do you want me to go down and chase them away? It's so noisy. The woman shook her head. Forget it. They can't get in anyway. This is the Sword Vein's internal affairs. We don't have to worry about it. Senior brother Fatty, I'm preparing to return to Zhou. When Little E comes out, I'll have to trouble you to let him know. It's nothing urgent. Just let him know that you're safe. Fatty nodded while trembling. Don't worry, sister-in-law. I'll stay here and not go anywhere. If you want to return to Zhou, the brothers will send you off. Over there, Xiang Lu, Jiaoying, Ba Shi, and the others can. The woman laughed. Thank you for your kind intentions, senior brothers. Do you think I'm a weak woman? Although the journey isn't far, it won't be good to delay your cultivation. Fatty didn't agree. It won't delay anything. If you don't go out, you'll just be sleeping here. Just treat it as one less afternoon nap. Sister-in-law's strength isn't a problem, but Heaven's choice is a mess now. There are often half-immortals coming to view the steel. With us immemorial beasts around, nothing will go wrong. Everyone has good intentions. Sister-in-law can't refuse. The woman sighed. The fierce immemorial beasts in the ancient books were very straightforward in real life. It was completely different from what she imagined. Of course, it was only because of one person. While the outside was noisy, Lu Xiaoyi was having fun inside the Sword Tao Steel. It was painful and fast. The Sword Disciple realm was Li Wuya's complete combat state before he became an immortal. It was the combination of the first 8 realms. It was no longer restricted to a fixed method, but an all-round whole. Most importantly, it was no longer controlled by cultivation. If one removed the dullness caused by intelligence, Li Wuya in the Sword Disciple realm could be said to have 70% to 80% of his peak strength before he became an immortal. This was a terrifying combat state. Lu Xiaoyi really couldn't beat him. The main reason was the pressure of cultivation. It was the most basic thing of a cultivator. It was something that he rarely paid attention to in his 3,000 years of growth. Swordsmen focused on explosive power. Lu Xiaoyi relied on this point to move unhindered in the cultivation world. There were very few opponents. If he felt that his elemental energy cultivation was showing signs of insufficient, he would solve it by leaping, or use leaping to recover, or simply run away after a blow. But in the Sword Disciple realm, he had nowhere to run. In the beginning, he could fight evenly with Li Wuya. But soon, he would be defeated because he couldn't keep up with the intensity and frequency of his attacks. There were many reasons for this. Some of them were due to the difference in cultivation level, and some of them were due to the fact that the transformation of the Tao realm into combat power was not yet at its peak. These are usually not big problems for him, but when facing a fighting machine like Li Wuya, they were completely exposed. If he wanted to find his own weakness and wanted to know his future direction, it was actually very simple. He just had to find an opponent who was better than him. This was the value of entering the Sword Tao Steel. Cultivation required time to accumulate and polish. He couldn't solve it in a short period of time, but he could solve the problem of transforming Dao state into combat power. He also learned from Li Wuya how to squeeze out the potential of Dao state. He had all kinds of wonderful ideas, all kinds of bold and imaginative ideas, all kinds of unscrupulous. When he gradually understood all of this, he had many wonderful ideas that were completely his own. When he had a flash of inspiration, he was no longer defeated by Li Wuya. He spent another 10 years doing this. He felt that he had gained enough. As a top combat expert, he knew that there must be a limit to how much he could learn from others. He had to know when to stop. What he learned was the essence, the way of thinking, and the concept of Dao state. It was to take the opponent's things and make them his own, and not become another Li Wuya. He had enough time. If he continued to learn, it would become a simple imitation. That was not what he wanted. As the end of this learning of the sword Dao, in order to show the highest respect to this great sword disciple, he decided to defeat Li Wuya for real according to the most solemn etiquette of the swordsman. From this, he would announce the end of an era. In the history of the sword vein, he would eventually become the next leader. He also had many powerful means, such as his current abnormal body and his gains in creating Dao state. Trapped in the limitations of the era, Li Wuya didn't understand these. This was his chance. Chapter 23:55. Lu Xiaoyi adjusted himself to his best condition. After a short period of recovery, he stepped into the realm of a sword disciple for the last time. He had already thought of a strategy. Since he did not have an advantage in other aspects, he would use his newly created Dao to gain the upper hand and kill his opponent in one go. He would take advantage of the moment when his opponent was not used to it. This was a little bullying. Jianing did not have any intelligence. If it was the real Li Wuya, he might not be able to do it. It was just a ceremonial choice. He was very clear about the gap between him and Li Wuya. If he faced Li Wuya in person, he would definitely lose, but Li Wuya would not be able to kill him. If he waited for 2 more steps, he might be able to suppress Li Wuya, but he would not be able to resolve the matter of life and death. The real life and death depended on external factors. That was another matter. But now, let him bully this Jianing who did not have much intelligence. Sword light spread out and attacked Jianing at the same time. Jianing was using the convergence of the sword river. This was the most common opening of a swordsman's battle. It was simple, but not simple. This was because the following converged sword could transform into any Dao state attack. Lu Xiaoyi was different from his usual self. He used Li Wuya's astronomical swordsmanship, Mjolnir. His only goal was to attack his opponent first. Lightning was one of the few attacks in the world that was faster than flying swords. This time, he would not follow his opponent's rhythm just to learn. In a real battle, a swordsman should have his own rhythm. The mutated Mjolnir made Jianing aware of the danger. The surging sword river began to change direction and accurately slashed out. The hidden danger was completely eliminated before the lightning was formed. This was one of Li Wuya's abilities that he was very envious of. It was as if Li Wuya was born with an intuition towards lightning. He could destroy the lightning at the most crucial point before it was formed. Jianing could not learn this ability yet. Of course, he had his own abilities. For example, with his physique of insight, he was not afraid of lightning at all. What he wanted was Li Wuya's destructive sword. Before the lightning was formed, it turned into a hole. He was very familiar with the devouring Dao state. This was also his goal. This change was the opportunity to open a gap. No matter how outstanding Li Wuya was 20,000 years ago, how could he understand the Dao of devouring now? However, what happened next left Lu Xiaoyi dumbfounded. Just as he formed a devouring cave image, Jianing executed another devouring cave image with a flip of his hand. It was the exact opposite. The two Dao of Devour Realm cultivators were competing with each other in terms of their understanding of the great Dao. In this entanglement, Lu Xiaoyi was actually at a disadvantage. It was a little unbelievable. Did Li Wuya already understand the great Tao of Devour? There seemed to be no other reason that could explain this situation. Lu Xiaoyi did not believe that his ability in the devouring great Tao was inferior to an ancient person from 20,000 years ago because of the changes in the epic. Even though he boasted that he had reached a higher level in the path of devouring, it was still an embarrassing experience for him. He had indeed gone deep into this great Tao, but compared to the Crow ancestor, he was far from enough. The so-called competition had become a learning experience. The Crow ancestor used his rich Tao realm transformations to show him what true and complete engulfment was. It was a bit of a shock. That was how Lu Xiaoyi felt. He had studied the Tao realm for a long time, combined with the changes in the universe's environment, the influence of various new trends, a long period of preparation, and more than half of his knowledge of the Khanate Great Tao. Even with such an advantage, he still could not compare to Li Wuya's knowledge from 20,000 years ago. Perhaps Crow ancestor only understood these things after becoming an immortal. Lu Xiaoyi found excuses for his unbearable behavior. How long had it been since Li Wuya became an immortal and flew to the immortal court to force Tao into the lower realm? What did he experience? What did he do? It was still a mystery to this day. Did he collude with the Tao Lord of Destiny during this period? Did he also set up a backup plan for himself in various parts of the universe? Did he have a clear understanding of the future great Tao during this period? No one knew these things. According to historical records, this period was not long, but no matter how short it was enough for a perfected golden immortal to set up what he thought should be set up. So he left his latest understanding of the Tao realm after becoming an immortal in the Sword Tao tablet. It seemed like this was the only explanation. Lu Xiaoyi, who was a little dejected, realized that he still could not truly defeat Li Wuya. Since he could not defeat him, then he would continue to learn. After all, he was his senior, and it was not embarrassing. Competition was the best learning process. Lu Xiaoyi pulled himself back to the position of a primary school student and not a leader. He seriously competed with Crow ancestor in the Tao realm of devouring. He admitted that his Tao realm was indeed inferior, but it was not completely useless. He had the core, but he was still lacking in depth. Especially in the development of the Tao realm of devouring, it was his weakest point. His main direction of devouring was the devouring of celestial phenomena. Crow ancestors' devouring had already jumped out of this natural category and was more derived from other aspects, such as the devouring of living beings, cultivators, and Tao realm cultivators. In fact, these derived devouring were the things that really overturned the existing order of the immortal court. The devouring of living beings and cultivators was focused on combat. The devouring of other Tao realm cultivators was the future of the immortal court in his imagination. The key was that there were upper and lower Tao realm cultivators. If you did not work hard, your Tao realm would be flawed and could not keep up with the development of the universe, and you might be devoured by others. One had to admit that Crow ancestor was very far-sighted. After 20,000 years, he knew the development of the universe like the back of his hand. It was really incredible. Lu Xiaoyi was a thick-skinned person. Since he could not go against his master, he immediately became an obedient little disciple. It was not good for his own ancestors' things to be lost, right? With such a mentality, he began to endlessly entangle with Crow ancestor. Fortunately, although his Tao realm of devouring was not as good as Crow ancestors, he had a solid foundation and could always deal with Crow ancestor. Obviously, Crow ancestor's Tao realm this time was completely different from before. Previously, Crow ancestor spared no effort in transforming the Tao realm into combat strength. 10% of the Tao realm would produce 11% of the combat strength. Now, it was a different method. 10% of the Tao realm would only produce 70 to 80% of the combat strength. It was also because Crow ancestor went easy on him that Lu Xiaoyi could rely on his own devouring to barely maintain it. After learning, absorbing, and adding his own understanding, it finally became his own, Crow Ancestor was still very reasonable. He knew that after he became an immortal, it was impossible for others to fight against him. That was why he was not as sharp in this field. Now, he was more like an elder. Lu Xiaoyi thought so, but he did not consider that he did not actually look like a disciple. Chapter 2356. There was too much to learn about the Tao realm. There was no possibility of a sudden flash of inspiration. The reason why the Foundation was called the Foundation was because it was complicated and trivial. It covered everything, no matter how big or small, was deeply foreshadowed and involved a wide range of things. Only the brain of a half-immortal could hold it. If it was the yuanying of a supreme whose brain was not developed enough, they might not be able to hold it. Lu Xiaoyi was able to store it all because of his extensive knowledge in the realm of Tao. Many pieces of knowledge that might seem completely new to others were nothing more than variations of a certain great Tao in his eyes. Therefore, his learning speed was extremely fast. However, even if he had such unique conditions, it took him more than 30 years to fully understand the Tao of devouring of the Crow Ancestor and gradually form it into something of his own. 30 years. It was almost the entire time for a mortal to be most energetic. It was also a golden time limit that a Foundation establishment cultivator could not waste. However, for a half-immortal to study the Tao realm, this period of time was really short. Many cultivators might not even be able to get started on a certain Tao in 30 years. Lu Xiaoyi did not need such a long time. However, he never simply imitated the things he learned. He insisted on his own things, digested and absorbed them. In the end, he formed a devouring system that was different from the Crow Ancestors. He had such a character. He respected authority and despised it. This was something in his bones. It had never changed after cultivating for more than 3,000 years. After 30 years, his little grand disciple had learned the things of the Crow Ancestor. Therefore, he began to be restless again. He was a little competitive. He recognized that the Li Sword Ancestor was awesome. However, it could not be that his sword shadow was still so awesome after 20,000 years, right? If he did not kill him this time, his self-confidence would be a little embarrassing. Therefore, he withdrew from the sword disciple realm and recuperated again. He adjusted his condition to the best state and went back to kill the Crow Ancestor. He was very persistent. However, he obviously could not use the Tao of devouring this time. He decided to use another newly created Tao, the Tao of heavenly calamity. After a few breaths, Lu Xiaoyi, who was embarrassed, fell into a bitter battle again. Just like before, when it came to devouring, Li Wuya was still incomparably powerful in the heavenly tribulation. He was still a few streets ahead of him, and he was still beaten to a pulp. It seemed a little illogical. Could an immortal's ability really reach this level? It wasn't like he hadn't come into contact with immortals before. Immortal rocks collided head-on, and he had even encountered immortals who used immortal artifacts and had immortal roots implanted in them. Although it wasn't easy to deal with them, he still managed to deal with them in the end. Unlike this time, he was beaten like a dog in the field he was most proficient in. But then again, an immortal who had the Tao of Golden Immortal should be different, right? Since the Crow Ancestor could comprehend the devouring technique within a short period of time after becoming an immortal, why couldn't he comprehend the heavenly tribulation? After all, in a message he left for the heavenly calamity. To an immortal like Crow Ancestor, 1 or 2 didn't seem to make a difference. Therefore, another 30 years. Lu Xiaoyi became the little disciple again. He learned the Tao of heavenly calamity from the Tao of heavenly calamity. The Tao of heavenly calamity was the same as before. He did not kill anyone in the Tao of heavenly calamity. He still mainly demonstrated and taught. One taught, and the other learned. In this space, the supreme mystery of the universe was revealed. Time passed by quickly. When Lu Xiaoyi finished learning the Tao of heavenly calamity and came out, the number of swordsmen outside the Sword Tao Steel did not decrease. Instead, there were more and more of them. 60 years was the life of a mortal. However, for these cultivators who were at least at the Gene Dan level, it was nothing. Curiosity was the most important thing. Moreover, the Willow Sea was a good place for cultivation. Everyone was happy to gather together. For swordsmen, who often needed to learn from each other, it was not worse than returning home. The main reason for the increasing number of people was the scattered swordsmen from the main world. It was not easy for them to come here. However, when they arrived, they found that the Sword Tao Steel had closed the door to all visitors. There seemed to be no other choice but to stay here and wait. This was not the rice shop on the next street. If there was no rice today, they could come back tomorrow. Among all the cultivators gathered, there was a half-immortal swordsman with the highest realm. He came from the distant Five Rings Dome, which was the sect of sword ancestrally. This made the gathering even more natural. This cultivator's name was Guang Ming. He was actually Escort Lu's senior brother. Of course, he was not now. Although his realm had long been caught up and surpassed by junior brother Lu, he was still an insurmountable mountain to other swordsmen. He was at the top of the pyramid. He was the youngest among the group of young gods in Xinyuan. When everyone was trying their best to enter the ancient technique, he chose the degenerate realm. This was his personal choice. The sect had no right to interfere. There were two general reasons for this. First, the upper realm of the ancient technique was so far away that it was completely up to the heavens to make a living. For the sake of the upper realm of the ancient technique, he missed the new era and established his Tao. Second, since it was the new era, who knew how much difference there would be between the ancient technique and the degenerate realm? Both the inner and outer realm could disappear. Why should he care about the difference between the ancient technique and the degenerate realm? Not long after he entered the degenerate realm, he came here through the outer realm projection. He wanted to see the magic of Ancestor Crow's Sword Tao Steel with his own eyes. But he did not expect to be lonely. After listening to everyone's description of the Sword Tao Steel, he could not do anything. It was hard to figure out the changes in Ancestor Crow's Sword Tao Steel from the outside. He was also stubborn. He would not give up until he reached his goal. For the past few years, he had been consolidating his realm here. He had also made many swordsman friends. Apart from cultivation, he was not bored. There were also swordsmen who advised him that since the Sword Tao Steel was temporarily closed, there were more than 10 other innate great Taos in the Heaven's Choice continent. It was better to take a look elsewhere than to wait here. This was a good way to save time, but Guang Ming did not think so. In his opinion, the other innate great Taos belonged to others. Only the Sword Tao Steel belonged to Xinyuan. Before he figured out what was going on, he would not leave. After waiting for a few years, he was, after all, a demigod. But he noticed something strange that no one else had noticed. One day, he inadvertently left the Sword Tao Steel. With another flash, he appeared in the clouds thousands of miles away. The clouds were thick and one could not see through them. Therefore, although there were many swordsmen around the Sword Tao Steel, no one noticed the abnormality. A monster was tearing a mountain deer apart with its bare hands and eating it happily. Guang Ming clasped his hands. Guang Ming, disciple of Xinyuan. Greetings, fellow Taoist. The monster wiped its bloody hand on its mouth, but it only made the blood smell even more. It then chuckled. You're from Xinyuan? I know what you want to ask, but before that, we need to have a drink. Also, I heard that the human secret food is very delicious. I haven't eaten it for a long time. Chapter 2357. Lu Xiaoyi was struggling in the reincarnation Tao realm. Among the 3 Tao realms that he created, he was most familiar with the engulfment Tao. He also understood a lot about the heavenly tribulation. However, his understanding of the reincarnation Tao was still mostly at the level of the original reincarnation Tao. This should have been the direction that senior sister Yin Sheng was working towards. He had not done it yet. Judging from the quality of his spirit and willpower, he believed that as long as senior sister promised, she would keep her promise. Engulfment, heavenly tribulation, and the new reincarnation were the 3 main points of overturning the existing order of the immortal court. The purpose of engulfment was to complete the survival of the fittest. The purpose of heavenly tribulation was the law of the jungle against the immortals. The reincarnation Tao was to dig out the roots of reincarnation and cultivation. The three overturning Taos were indispensable for him to achieve his goal perfectly. Otherwise, the new era would be flawed. If the reforms were not thorough, it would be impossible to achieve such overturning after the new era, who did not want to succeed in this life and place their hopes on the next life. This was the wish of most people, including the Reformist Party. His only chance was to seize a fleeting moment during the chaos when the epoch changed. Therefore, the new reincarnation Tao realm was indispensable. However, Lu Xiaoyi's immersion in this Tao realm had not formed a system. His current reincarnation Tao realm was the old reincarnation Tao realm. There were some conceptual things that he had not had the time to put into practice. Under such circumstances, when he clashed with the Crow ancestors' new reincarnation Tao realm, he was immediately defeated. Once again, he was forced out of the Sword Disciple realm. The last time he experienced such awkwardness was when he was in the Foundation realm. Now that he was reliving it, he actually missed it. The reason why he was forced out was because he insisted on using the new reincarnation Tao realm instead of those Tao realms that he had mastered. This was his last bit of pride, his last shameful act. He was not pretending to be a grandson. He was a real grandson. However, he was best at treating himself as a grandson when he was pretending to be one and waiting for the day he became one. He pretended to be a grandson for 50 years. He spent 120 years in the Sword Disciple realm. If he added the experience in the Celestial state, he had spent 130 years on the Sword Tao tablet. In terms of effectiveness, it was worth it. To be able to help him establish 3 innovative great Taos in 130 years was something that others would not even dare to think about. He did it, but he did not feel any joy. Because in the long process of comprehending the Tao realm, he slowly realized that his previous thoughts might have fallen into a certain misconception. He suddenly realized that Jian Ying's unusualness in the 3 innovations might represent another possibility. In the beginning, he was surprised by the breadth of Li Wuya's Tao realm. But in the past 100 years, he had been pondering over this question. Given Li Wuya's style, would he go easy on him? Even the new Tao realm? At the very least, if Lu Xiaoyi set up a sword steel, he would not change his usual style. This was the Sword Tao steel. This was the place that Li Wuya left behind to guide his juniors. How could he hide it? If he didn't use the new Tao state, wouldn't the sword shadow in the Sword Apprentice state be exposed? He slowly stopped practicing the Tao realm. After 130 years, this was the first time he had entered the Sword Tao steel 3 times. It was as if the thing in front of him had a soul, and he spoke coldly. "Who are you?" The sword shadow in front of him did not answer, but it stopped the evolution of the Tao realm, just like him. This should not be the case in the Sword Tao steel. For a checkpoint, automatically starting the battle was inevitable. Otherwise, how could there be so much time to look at you affectionately? This sword shadow understood his words. Lu Xiaoyi did not ask any more questions. He just kept urging his aura. If he was just exchanging pointers before, now he really wanted to kill. Someone actually dared to pretend to be his ancestor in the Sword Tao steel. No matter who he was, he would never let him go. His intuition told him that he should be an immortal. A half-immortal could not have such an ability, especially the ability to subvert the Tao. But even if he was an immortal, should he have such an ability? Lu Xiaoyi's aura became stronger and stronger. When he started to attack, he would not stop until he was dead. Even if he had to destroy the Sword Tao steel in the end, he would not hesitate. Just as he let go of all his misgivings and prepared to attack, a deep voice slowly sounded. It seemed to be far away, yet close at the same time. It was as if it was not in this world, yet it was so clear that he could hear it. Who am I? Millions of years is too long. I can't even remember those boring names. If you must know, it seems like in the recent millions of years, they call me Hong Mao. Although Lu Xiaoyi's aura was no longer rising, it did not decrease in the slightest. Even if this was true and he was facing one of the four laws of the universe, he would not put down the sword in his hand. That voice continued, "It's too long. It's so long that I almost forgot who I am. What are you doing? Do you still exist? But you don't have to worry. The sword Dao steel will always be the swordsman's sword Dao steel. I was just watching you evolve and devour. So I was moved and went along with you." People, even if they die, they still have to leave something behind for their descendants. Actually, the rules are the same. If I don't leave anything behind now, I'm afraid that after the new era, I won't be able to leave anything behind. Lu Xiaoyi was still vigilant. There are close to 10,000 Dao steels in the Heaven's Choice continent. You're paying attention to every single one of them? If not, why is it the sword Dao steel? That voice faintly said, "Of course. Every single change of every Dao steel is in my heart. To me, it's just an instinct. The power of the laws of order is far from what you can imagine. As for why here, of course it's here. It can only be here. Because of the person who set up the steel. He did something that I have always wanted to do, but never had the chance to do. Because his descendant is still continuing his unfinished efforts. Then, seeing that everything is in line with my intentions, I will show you something that as a human, you will never be able to understand completely. Consider my attitude. Young man, don't think too much. In front of me, you are not even a chess piece." Lu Xiaoyi sneered. But one of the four greatest laws in the world will not waste time on someone who is not even a chess piece. The voice was calm. "That's right. If you're my chess piece, then you will definitely not be able to escape the attention of the other three laws. In the end, you will achieve nothing. That's why I said that you're not chess pieces. You are your own masters. I don't want to affect you. I just want to show my understanding to a descendant. Right now, the heavenly Tao is in chaos. There are countless Taos in the land of the Yellow Dragon. Many of them have thoughts of betraying the Taos. That's why I have the chance to do something here. This is your opportunity, but it is also my opportunity. So, no one needs to thank the other. Chapter 2358. Lu Xiaoyi's mind raced. He had a premonition about this, but he did not expect it to come true. In fact, he really did not think that this was a good thing. Before the change of the era, he tried his best not to expose these three new great Daos to the heavenly axiom. This was the strategy he had been insisting on. That was why Qing Xian and Yin Cheng were in the front while he waited for the right opportunity to act. It was not that he deliberately let his friends take the blame for him, but heaven's retribution to Qing Xian and reincarnation to Yin Cheng were their own choices. He could not persuade them otherwise. Later on, during his research on these three great Daos, he was acutely aware of a problem. His friends were in the front, but their understanding of the Tao state might not succeed. This was also the reason why Yin Cheng did not cause too much of a commotion when he set up the tablet in the land of the Yellow Dragon. If Lu Xiaoyi were to set up these three Tao state, he would immediately poke a big hole in the sky. Because his understanding of these three great Taos was close to the truth, it was enough to make many people restless. Therefore, he had secretly made changes to his plan for the change of the era. In order to ensure the success rate, he had to be the last one to do it. But that was a change that would only appear at the last moment. It was still too early. Of course, when they gathered at the fifth ring, he also hinted to his friends that they must have a second choice. To put more bluntly, Lu Xiaoyi wanted to take their first choice. The perfect situation would be for Qing Xian and Yin Cheng to set up two tablets. At the last moment, he would shoulder these three new great Daos. If there were any problems, he would face them alone. Life and death would depend on the turn of the era. Therefore, he rarely revealed his achievements in these three Dao state, except in the Sword Dao tablet, which he thought was the safest place. In the end, it was exactly the safest place that he thought was the safest place, but it did not escape the attention of Hong, and it was the most down-and-out Hong Mao. This fellow was the most miserable of the four Hong. Many cultivation orthodoxies only recognized the three Hong, but not the fourth Hong. It was squeezed into the negative space to preside over the order. it could be seen how unsatisfactory it was for the past millions of years. Was it really a good idea to mix with such an existence? Should he implicate himself in it? But now it seemed that it was destined to be targeted by Hong Mao. From the moment Li Wuya came here to erect the sword Dao steel, the sword vein had already established some sort of connection with Hong Mao. There was no way to avoid it. The problem was that he really wanted to know if Li Wuya's kidnapping of Dao De and the Dao Lord of Destiny had anything to do with Hong Mao. How deep was their relationship? He didn't even know where to start asking. He also didn't know if there would be karma if he asked. However, his worries were unnecessary. It was as if Hong Mao knew what he was thinking. Hong Mao's explanation was just right. There is one thing that you must understand. The change of epochs wasn't just the agreement of one of his laws. Even if he agreed, it wouldn't have succeeded. In truth, this was the decision of the four greats. This was the foundation. Change was necessary and unavoidable. The only difference was how to change. How much? To what extent? What direction? Therefore, the actions of Li Wuya and the Master of Fate had nothing to do with me. It was just that among the four herons, I was the one who wished to change completely. I couldn't have anything to do with you. That wouldn't be helping you, but harming you. I know this better than anyone else. After all, I've been with them for millions of years. I know the principles of their three laws too well. Lu Xiaoyi listened quietly and tried his best not to speak. I have some secrets that I want to keep inside. However, I can't deliberately impart them. As long as I do so, the other three greats will immediately know, unless it was comprehended by the cultivators of the lower realm themselves. I'll then use a certain method to deepen their understanding, just like what I did when I pretended to be Li Wuya here. There are more and more such cultivators with the arrival of the new epoch. For example, there are many aspiring half-immortals who are secretly working hard to devour the heavenly tribulation and reincarnation. It's not just you. The universe is vast. There are many humans who want to change it. Many of them are amazing people who can see the essence of things clearly. Lu Xiaoyi understood Hong Mao's words very well. It was the truth. As far as he knew, there were many friends around him who were aspiring to do this. This was only in his small circle. If the scope was expanded to the entire universe, then there would be even more people who understood it. What I want to do is to choose the most possible one among them. The mastery of the Tao realm, the belief in change, the ability to survive, etc. Congratulations, I couldn't find anyone more suitable than you. Therefore, I appeared here. You have to know that this is not a coincidence. There are no coincidences in the cultivation world. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. I'm the only one? You think too highly of me. There was no emotion in that voice. No, you're not the only one. In your situation, I still have other choices. I told everyone that you're the only one, and then I told them that for your safety, I even found a few scapegoats for you. The purpose is to make the three greats confused. This can be very cruel, but to the two of you, it does have the effect of covering each other. You can be a red flower or a green leaf. Which one you are depends on your ability. I think this is fair to the two of you, right? It was indeed very fair. For some reason, Lu Xiaoyi immediately thought of the bamboo hat's name. He was not afraid of competition. The only thing he was afraid of was being the only one. You're demonstrating the Tao realm here because you comprehended it yourself. Therefore, my participation will not attract the attention of the three greats. You're very smart. You didn't copy it. The last person who thought he had obtained a great opportunity and only knew how to copy it mechanically died. Inexplicably. So you see, you're not a chess piece and I'm not a gambler. It's just that we have a common interest, so we coincidentally made a move. I don't care how much you learn. What you want to change has nothing to do with me. Whether you're willing to take this step in the end or not, I won't force you. This is your own decision. It has nothing to do with me. He was very clear about it. However, he was probably helpless. From this, it could be seen that Hong Mao really did not have any resistance in front of the other three greats. I won't give you any advice, nor will I make a plan for you. No matter how the era changes, how the universe changes, you can forget about getting any information from me. I'm just a pitiful rule that has silently endured for tens of millions of years. Seeing that my efforts are about to be destroyed, I still can't resist and have to raise both hands to welcome it. The only thing I can do is to find those who have the same idea as me, and then show them my understanding of the Tao. But not all of it, because if I show everything, I'll be exposed. You can only rely on yourself to fill in the rest. I'll be honest. You're the most talented person I've ever seen. Lu Xiaoyi sneered. This last sentence, you've also said it to others, right? Chapter 23:59. That voice didn't reply. Thus, Lu Xiaoyi knew that he hadn't wrongly accused it. But this wasn't what he was concerned about. You said that your efforts will be destroyed. Are you referring to the Heaven's Choice continent? If so, in a certain sense, isn't this change of eras also an inner scroll of the Four Graces? The three of them will join forces to destroy the foundation that isn't legitimate? That voice didn't reply. Silence meant silence. It seemed that tens of millions of years of patience hadn't eliminated the estrangement between them. But what will happen to the mortals of the Heaven's Choice? Will they become sacrifices of the inner scroll of the heavenly Tao? There was silence again. After a long time, I don't know, because I won't appear in the new era. When the negative space disappears, I will disappear. This problem should be given to the new Hong, or the three of them, or not. But what is certain is that how to solve this problem is the necessary condition for the new Hong to ascend. So, you don't have to worry about this. This isn't a problem that you should worry about. But Lu Xiaoyi was entangled in this problem that Hong Mao regarded as a side issue. Although he didn't understand Hong's ability, Hong couldn't really transform into something to descend personally. They were the rules. Thus, they could only use the rules to restrict the actions of the cultivators below them. In other words, they couldn't guarantee that there would be no mistakes. They could only ensure that there wouldn't be any major losses. For example, a certain percentage of injuries? Even if there was a 10% loss, how much would it be in the billions? Even those who knew how to count their toes could calculate it. This was Hong's way of thinking about problems, because they stood from different perspectives. Hong stood from the perspective of the rules, while Lu Xiaoyi stood from the perspective of humans. This was completely different. Perhaps the new Hong would try his best to do something for his ascension. But since he didn't directly interfere, he would achieve his goal through the countless cultivators below him. Thus, he had to consider the problem of human nature. It was impossible for the subordinates to wholeheartedly complete the intentions of the higher-ups without any benefits. What were the benefits for cultivators? There were too many. But before the change of eras, establishing one's Tao was the greatest benefit. There was nothing else. Thus, solving this problem before the new era was far more suitable than after the new era. As long as the slightest bit of news was released, linking the safety of the mortals chosen by heaven to the establishment of the Tao, there would be no need for you to urge them. Naturally, countless people would rush over to pledge their lives. After the new era, how many people still had such thoughts? Lu Xiaoyi asked a purely technical question. You are the creator of the Heaven's Choice continent. For thousands of years, the Heaven's Choice continent was gradually formed under your watch. Then, I presume that you are the thought entity that understands the Heaven's law the most in this universe. I just want to know, if I want to break Heaven's Choice into tens, or even hundreds of pieces, how should I do it? That voice was silent for a long time, leaving Lu Xiaoyi speechless. This Hong Mao's mainframe was a little slow. I wonder if it's because of the aging of the equipment, or because of the lack of energy from the other three greats. But at least it didn't remain silent. For tens of millions of years, the growth and expansion of the Heaven's Choice continent has been a pattern. It attracts the Heaven's Choice continent, and after a long period of time, it fuses together, just like thousands of small stones being squeezed together to form a large stone. Every star that fuses with the Heaven's Choice continent will leave behind traces of splicing. We call this a weld. In the long river of time, some of these welds are very strong, but some have flaws. If they suddenly appear in the universe of the origin world and collapse, they will definitely crack and collapse from these flawed welds. But I don't have any information in this area. Too much time has passed, so you can only look for it yourself. This is a huge project, and you might not be able to complete it in your lifetime. Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently, "This is my problem." That voice reminded him again. I want to remind you that no matter what method you use, it's impossible to have no losses. After all, in such a large world domain, the slightest movement can cause the world to collapse. I understand what you mean. If you take the initiative to collapse Heaven's choice continent in advance, the loss of population will be much smaller. If you wait until the new era and then wait for the universe to collapse, even with Hong's protection, even if the ratio is acceptable, the absolute number will still be astronomical. But have you thought about it? If you let the universe collapse, this will be the pain of the universe's changes and the price of the pain. Just like in the face of a natural disaster, no one needs to bear the responsibility. But if you take the initiative to collapse it, even if the number of deaths will be much smaller, the loss of millions of people will still be counted on your head. Are you sure you still want to do it? This time, it was Lu Xiaoyi's turn to be silent. A very realistic problem was that it was safest to not do anything. As long as you do it, there will definitely be karma, especially in such a large world domain. Even if you told them in advance, there would still be countless coincidences that would happen. It wasn't like you were cutting a cake that could be perfectly cut according to your plan. A single crack that went out of your plan would cause the mortals in the city to face a calamity of destruction. There are many methods, but this is just a preliminary prediction. There will be many people involved. Let's take it one step at a time. Perhaps there will be a saint who will step forward. Hong Mao once again sank into habitual contemplation. This was the world he had created, including the Heaven's Choice continent and the anti-space. He had attained Tao late and was unable to compete with his 3 senior brothers. His heart was loftier than the heavens, and he could only create such a world to satisfy his pursuit of Tao. Strictly speaking, he had failed. After thousands of years of hard work, he could not see any hope. No one was interested in his ideal Tao. Until now, his living space was being squeezed. But misfortune could be a blessing in disguise, and a blessing in disguise. In other words, when he was forced into a desperate situation, he saw the hope of a reversal. He actually did not have the right to speak about the change of eras. But the formation of the New World could not avoid the anti-space, Heaven's Choice continent. Therefore, the 4 herons formed a tacit understanding. Use the price of him, Hong Mao, withdrawing from the stage of cultivation history in exchange for the opportunity of the Heaven's Choice continent to integrate into the main world. Death did not mean anything to a law, because a law would never disappear. It would only change, integrate, and become a part of other laws. It was just that it no longer had the right to vote against. The formation of the Heaven's Choice continent was unexpected. Originally, he just wanted to create an anti-space to fight against the main world. These humans were just a byproduct of this process. But now, these byproducts determined its future. 100 billion people was the biggest problem he had set for the other 3 herons. No one could ignore it, not even Hong. This was the foundation. It would never change. Chapter 2360. Hong Mao had no choice but to leave the stage of cultivation history, but it was also inevitable. After holding on for millions of years, he could no longer hold on to his own world. Because in the negative space, there was no Tao that belonged to him. Not a single one. Even if the innate Tao tablets were arranged neatly here and the postnatal Tao tablets were everywhere, there was no innate Tao that belonged to him alone. There were countless reasons, but the other 3 were definitely behind it. A world without innate Tao couldn't last long. For millions of years, Hong Mao had been controlling everything in the negative space. He helped to build so many tablets, and helped the people of Heaven's Choice obtain the most extensive knowledge of Tao. He hoped that one of them could change the order of Tao. Only after millions of years did he understand that if he didn't disappear, it would never happen. The new era was the trend of the universe. As a Hong, he had to follow this trend, but in following it, he could bring in his own private goods. For example, the three Hong. Their goal was to completely eliminate this little junior brother that had harassed them for millions of years, completely erasing the existence of a negative space, because this was abnormal for a normal world. The Great Peacock also accepted this change, because it could achieve its lifelong goal through its own death. He was gone, but his Tao would rise in the main world, affecting and completely overturning the order of cultivation. In a sense, this was his success. He had already seen the signs. More and more humans were awakening and realizing the importance of his ideals to the cultivation world. Devouring, heaven's tribulation, reincarnation, these were the most important core. He had finally waited for this day. To Allah, it wasn't important whether he could see it or not. As long as his Tao could be popular in the new era, he would live in it. But there was a problem here. Just like what the swordsman said, the survival of the people in the Heaven's Choice continent would affect everyone's fate. The lower the cultivation level, the smaller the effect. Below true monarch, it was almost negligible. But half immortals would be affected by karma, and there would only be more immortals. To the four Hong, this was extremely important. If they couldn't handle these billions of people well, the three Hong might lose their position in the new era, and his thousands of years of effort would be destroyed. If he couldn't protect the common people, then there was no need to talk about a new Tao. In the relationship between the four Hong, the Heaven's Choice continent would become the hottest potato. Whoever ate it would burn their mouth. However, the swordsman proposed a solution that he had never thought of before. Split the swordsman. These were two different ways of doing things. He wanted to throw the hot potato to the San Hong after the new era, while the swordsman's method was to solve it themselves before the new era. If they solved it well, their revolutionary power would be acknowledged by the heavenly axiom. This was indeed the way of swordsmen. They always pursued the initiative and would never hand it over to others. However, when it came to a large domain with a population of over 100 billion, the difficulty of the operation was so complicated that no one dared to guarantee its success. Even it did not dare to do it. Not even San Hong. How many losses could the heavenly Tao tolerate? 10 billion? Or hundreds of millions or tens of millions? Before something happened, who could accurately measure it? Who could make the final judgment after the incident? Even it couldn't figure out the gains and losses involved. Lu Xiaoyi felt that this guy was about to crash, so he expressed his opinion. Whether you agree or not, whether you support me or not, I will still do it. Just as you said, we're just chess friends who occasionally play chess. I don't have to do anything for you, and you don't have to bear any responsibility for me. I won't think too much about whether the losses are reasonable or not. I will only think about my responsibility. Even if I make a mistake, who hasn't? The heavenly Tao should be able to tolerate young people making mistakes, right? Hong Mao felt that its thousands of years of thinking was about to be confused. Allow you to make mistakes? Mistakes that involve billions of human lives? You're not an ordinary kind of person. It originally had a very clear concept, but after coming into contact with this swordsman, it suddenly became complicated. As expected of the biggest shit stirrer in the cultivation world. He was born with the ability to stir clear water into muddy water, and finally into mud. Should you sit back and watch? Or should it think about this question carefully? But before that, the Heaven's Choice continent was its territory after all. Everything that happened here was more or less related to it. So, it couldn't escape. So, it had to at least remind this swordsman. The Heaven's Choice continent's plates have been fused together for thousands of years. It's very difficult to determine the boundaries of the plates through the ability of cultivators. Where's the weak point? There is only one chance. When the great Tao of space collapses, at that moment, the plates of the Heaven's Choice continent will show the boundaries of the original stars when space collapses. It would also reveal the most accurate way to split it. I can do more, but I can't do it. If I do it, you will be exposed. Lu Xiaoyi nodded to express his understanding. He couldn't be exposed to San Hong for the time being. Even if he was very dazzling now, his actions didn't constitute a fatal threat in San Hong's eyes. He was just an ordinary man. He could jump higher and jump more happily, but it wouldn't affect the overall situation. He lamented, "As Hong, can't the four of you sit down and have a good discussion? Everyone working together is originally a very simple matter, but you have to sell fake medicine in the negative space, causing everyone to lose their direction." The voice replied very quickly this time. "My medicine isn't fake. It's a new medicine. It's just that I didn't get the right to circulate it in the cultivation world. Do you think I want to sell these? Can I enter the existing system? It's already controlled by others. As long as I sell it, it will affect other people's interests. So I can only set up a Tao tablet in the Heaven's Choice continent to sell imitations. I hope that after eating too many imitations, I will be able to eat something unique to myself. Forget it. It's useless to talk about these things. I will show you what I know. As for your path, it has nothing to do with me." Lu Xiaoyi agreed. "Yes, it doesn't matter." The voice stopped. The sword moved, and sword light filled the sky again. Lu Xiaoyi knew that Hong Mao had left. He had no interest in continuing. He withdrew from the sword disciple realm and stayed in the sword tablet space, carefully thinking about everything that had happened. After cultivating for more than 3,000 years, he finally began to come into contact with the true top of the cultivation world. With a Hong Mao? Yes and no. These thoughts could be Hong Mao's. But as Hong, it was impossible for him to talk to a lower realm cultivator like this. The only way Hong could talk was through the rules and the great Tao. Because it was a rule, how could it be the same as a human? This was the reason why it always seemed like it was going to crash at any time. No matter who it was a difficult thing to impersonate Hong to convey a message. Then, this person should be a living person who was in cahoots with Li Wuya and the Tao Lord of Fate. A few golden immortals didn't seem to be too big. Chapter 2361. In this cultivation world, not having enough brains was fatal. But what Lu Xiaoyi was most proud of was the calmness that always existed in his heart. He would never speak incoherently because of authority and lose his ability to think independently. This was a huge game of chess. Intricate and complicated, unpredictable. Every person or force that had the ability to play a role would participate in it. No one would watch coldly from the sidelines. Even Hong had entered the stage. There was no reason for the golden immortals to sit still. There was no need to guess who it was. To put it nicely, it was doing a good deed without leaving a name. Actually, it was just a financial backer below the stage. Seeing that this person was putting in so much effort, he gave him a flower. He was very clear that he would never be able to understand the intricacies of this. The key was to understand what he wanted. As for the rest, it was fine to feign civility and not treat anyone as a savior. Even if it was a golden immortal, even if it was Hong, his only savior was himself. The benefits were still very obvious. He had a deeper understanding of the wonders of the three realms and knew how to split the Heaven's Choice. Otherwise, with the size of the Heaven's Choice continent, it would be an impossible task to completely investigate the strength of its internal structure. After sorting out his thoughts, he threw this fortuitous encounter to the side. Who cares? With a long laugh, he rushed into the realm of sword disciples. This time, he had to beat the old man down. In the universe, the new generation would replace the old. Only by beating the old man down would he be able to show the greatest respect to his seniors. This was probably what Li Wuya wanted to see the most. A moment later, the sword Tao tablet shone brightly. Lu Xiaoyi walked out proudly. He was greeted by a huge word that was undergoing an unbelievable change. Without any specific prize, it was not within Li Wuya's consideration at all. This word kept changing. Light and shadow intersected, forming another space. This was the big prize that Senior was so magnanimous. If you beat me, you have the qualifications to establish another realm here. 10th realm. Lu Xiaoyi bowed deeply and thanked Senior for his praise. Then he naturally wrote 4 big words on the 10th realm. Sword Soldier Realm. Swordsmen, this was how they improved. Everyone would make a ladder for those who came after them. There was no end to it. It did not mean that it was above the realm of Sword Disciple. It was just another choice. The inheritance of the sword vein did not need to be separated so clearly. Later on, when someone else reached the next realm, as long as they could defeat Li Wuya and the shitstick Lu, they would reach the 11th realm. With a shake of his body, he entered the realm. He needed to create a sword shadow for himself here, so that he could fully display his battle prowess. He couldn't let others say that he was just here to make up the numbers. Outside the sword Dao steel, there was a similar burst of brilliance. With one look, one could tell that it was impossible for it to collapse. A Yuanying swordsman laughed. What did I say? Well, I said that it was an upgrade. None of you believed me. You all said that I was being whimsical, only reporting good news and not bad news. Now look at this brilliance. Who knows what will happen inside? Will there be a VIP room? Special services? Custom arrangement? Everyone was in a good mood. This was good news. All these years of waiting were not in vain. But who knew what surprises awaited them? This matter was mysterious. When the other great Dao steels were collapsing, the sword Dao steel did the opposite. Who knew what this meant? When the time comes, the heavens and earth will work together. Such a change was really exciting. It also meant that the opening was not far away. 130 years. What kind of transformation would take so long? A few months later, one morning, most of the swordsmen were meditating outside the sword Dao steel. The intersection of yin and yang was the most important point of the day. There was no distinction between realms. This was a very solemn scene. With the sword Dao steel as the center, the swordsmen sat around it. The formation of hundreds of cultivators looked very majestic. However, there was an impatient Jindan cultivator. He hastily ended his cultivation and walked around the sword Dao steel. This was a sign that he was not experienced enough. As he walked, he bumped into the sword Dao steel. In the past, he would be gently ejected. It was as if there was a layer of energy covering the sword Dao steel. He loved to bump into the sword Dao steel like this. Who knows? He might be the first lucky person to enter the upgraded sword Dao steel. This was a very childish way of thinking. Even a perfected cultivator would not do such a thing, except for little Jean Dan, who had a little bit of a mortal heart. But this time, little Jean Dan disappeared after bumping into the sword Dao steel. Immediately, there was an uproar outside the sword Dao steel. Although all of them pretended to be diligent in their cultivation, their consciousness was always focused on the sword Dao steel. Once little Jean Dan disappeared, hundreds of streaks of light appeared. In the blink of an eye, the area outside the sword Dao steel was empty. It was as if there was no one there. Little Jean Dan had just entered. He was still in a daze. He immediately reacted and said, "I'm the first." The area around him was already crowded with people. It was still the same sword Dao steel space. There was no ceiling, no tiles, no lanterns, no flags, and no atmosphere. But everyone immediately realized that the sword Dao steel was different. The 9 realms of the sword Dao steel had become the 10 realms. The word reward that was once hanging high in the air was gone. It was replaced with the word punishment. Sword soldier realm. Escort, Lu has increased his realm. Some perfected cultivators immediately realized something. At this moment, all the swordsmen understood why the sword Dao steel was sealed. It was different from what they had guessed. It was not because it was on the verge of collapse, nor was it because it was being renovated. It was because Escort Lu had challenged Li Wuya in the past 130 years. He had succeeded. Hence, there was the 10th realm that belonged solely to Escort Lu. In other words, if anyone here succeeded in their challenge, they would be able to reach the 11th realm, the 12th realm, layer by layer. The Golden Core cultivator laughed heartily. I talked to Escort Lu, and he even patted me on the shoulder. I think he also thinks highly of my potential. Someone beside him said disdainfully, "It's more likely that he thinks you look like shit," but their excitement was illusory. It was like the moon in the water and the flowers in the mirror. They could only look at it but not feel it, because they did not have the qualifications to enter. Not to mention the 10th realm, they did not even have the qualifications to enter the 9th realm or the 8th realm. The strongest perfected cultivator here could only enter the 7th realm, the Sword Dao realm. He could not even last long. To them, the Sword Soldier realm was just a pie in the sky. It was an unattainable goal. But they quickly realized that the second change in the Sword Dao steel was closely related to them. It was the word punishment. Lu Xiaoyi's attitude towards cultivators who could not last long in their realm was different from his predecessor, Li Wuya. Li Wuya was a reward, and a reward that was incomparably ugly. Lu Xiaoyi was a punishment, and a punishment that was incomparably wretched. Go out and run naked. Otherwise, you will be stripped of your qualifications to enter the Sword Dao steel again. P.S. Recommend a book, Transmigrating to the Han Dynasty as Chun Ping by Yushu Jinlan. Interested friends, add it as a bookmark. It's not easy for newcomers. Chapter 2362. Lu Xiaoyi was in a very good mood as he watched the sword cultivators wailing and howling outside the Sword Dao steel from high in the clouds. He was not a pervert. It was not a joke. This was the punishment method used by the sword soldiers, but it had a very deep psychological meaning. Without a doubt, the swordsmen here were all hard-working to the point of torturing themselves. They could wield the same sword year after year, unless they reached a level that they were satisfied with. This was necessary for battle, but for cultivation, it was terrible. They needed to understand what it meant to cultivate happily, and not always have a bitter and vengeful attitude. Such an attitude would cause the sword vein to change bit by bit, turning it into a killing machine. The most realistic thing was that this kind of training was not in line with the true meaning of cultivation. They would walk into a dead end, indulging in the temptation of techniques, and forget the most important path for cultivators. They needed to have a relaxed heart. This was not in conflict with hard-working training. But now, these swordsmen were in a special period before the arrival of a new era, and it was very difficult for them to maintain a normal and peaceful state of mind. Hence, their hard-working training became a shackle, and the more they struggled, the tighter it became. There were many ways to relax, but Lu Xiaoyi did not have the time to teach them, so he could only use the simplest, most wretched, and most rebellious method. When they could calmly circle around the Willow Sea, just like their seniors in the Sword Soldiers, they would naturally understand the meaning of cultivating happily. This was the only way he could help these swordsmen. Fat Otaku looked at these crazy humans from the clouds and laughed foolishly. What he could not understand was, how could such a small fellow have the nerve to show himself? Light had long known of his junior's pranks and was not surprised. He would not be surprised if he did this to the dome one day. Fifth ring, successfully passing through the cave elephant. The casualties are minimal. Most of them are due to excessive shock caused by the intense sound and light effects, which led to a series of complications. Most of them are elderly. The radiation is within a controlled range and did not cause any direct harm. Of course, the specific effects still need time to prove, but a few generations have passed, and we have not discovered any abnormalities. The fifth ring is getting further and further away from Cave Elephant. I won't go back anymore. Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. What do you mean by negligible? How negligible? Guang Ming was embarrassed. More than 1 million people died. When we passed through the cave, the sky above the city was like hell. Under the rays, space was distorted, lightning flashed, and thunder roared. They try their best, but some things can't be avoided just by trying. I heard that tens of thousands of people died during the carnival after the disaster. There's really no way. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. It was just a collision between reality and illusion. There were no earthquakes or collapses. Just the sound and light effects created by the rays had killed more than 1 million people. For the fifth ring, which had a population of 10 billion, it was just a 1 in a million chance, but the absolute number was still unacceptable. What he was thinking was that the splitting of the Heaven's Choice continent would definitely cause a commotion several times greater than the 5 rings. How many buildings could still be preserved under the cracks? The collapse of mountains, the collapse of riverbanks, the destruction of buildings, the backflow of seawater, plus the 100 billion people of Heaven's Choice. He suddenly realized why the Deluo golden deity was not optimistic about his splitting plan. At least, the karma of hundreds of millions of lives was not something that any cultivator could bear. Even if it was an immortal, he would probably be struck by the heavenly punishment and die without a burial place. His thinking was still a little too simple. He needed to discuss it with his friends. Yes, it would be best to leave it to Qing Xian. This was not shirking responsibility, but he wanted to help his friends. If Qing Xian's heavenly punishment and Yin Cheng's reincarnation were snatched away in the end, it would definitely cause them to be in a predicament in establishing Dao. This was not a simple problem of establishing another Dao. Dao required wholehearted devotion, not multitasking. If they could only choose to establish another Dao in the end, their progress and understanding might not be comparable to those who were focused on one Dao. This would be a big problem. Although he had not been to the land of the Yellow Dragon, but after all these years of experience, he had a vague idea about establishing Dao. From his point of view, was establishing Dao purely a competition of whose Dao state was higher? Even if it was purely a competition of Dao state, it was actually not easy to determine who was better. This was because the focus was different, and there was another important point. After establishing Dao in the future, the person who established Dao had the potential to deepen the Dao. These things couldn't be judged on paper. The 3 old fellows of the 5th ring taught him a lesson. They let him know that Dao also needed to be packaged. This was the difference between the Dao of humans and the Dao of nature. The characteristic of the Dao of humans was that there were a lot of artificial factors. Packaging was one, and there was another, which was to look at the contribution to the human world. If 2 people's Dao state were about the same, one of them only cared about himself while the other cared about the people of the universe. How would the Dao of heaven choose? Chapter 2363. Light went to the sword past steel, leaving behind a cautious fat otaku, who was respectfully waiting on the side. He could be considered an elder of 2 dynasties. Previously, he had hugged a powerful thigh, but that thigh collapsed on its own. Now, he had hugged another one. This ability was not ordinary. Not only did he need to be observant, he also needed to be able to endure humiliation, act dumb, and have a bit of luck. He originally had a companion, Cheng Huang, but it was not patient enough. In the end, it did not survive. Most of the ancient beasts are not here, right? He asked casually. Fat Otaku did not dare to answer casually. This swordsman's thigh was even harder to please than the previous one. He could not understand his intentions at all. Most of them are not here. They have all gone to the origin world to play. You also know that the Heaven's Choice continent is in a precarious situation. Who would still be here foolishly? Who knows what the future will be like? Therefore, they have gone out to the origin world to find a place for everyone to settle down. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. It was a very normal thought. Have you found it? Fat Otaku smiled awkwardly. Not yet. We have taken a liking to other creatures. We don't care about those that don't have a master, those that are neither high nor low. There are some targets that we are not satisfied with. You don't know. Although the origin world is very big, there are very few places that are suitable for us. We are also not willing to get involved with the sacred beasts. After all, we have only been here for a short time. To us, the difference between sacred beasts and vicious beasts will not disappear in 1,000,000 years, so. Lu Xiaoyi was silent. This was not what he had expected. The origin world was very big, but no matter how big it was, it could not withstand the exploration during the golden age of cultivation. The treasured places suitable for cultivation had long been occupied by others. The key was that before the arrival of the new era, it was not good to openly compete with others. After I leave, I will give you a mission. Gather these fellows back. I have something for them to do. Fat Otaku's heart trembled. This gathering of ancestors, other than fighting, the only difference was who they were fighting. Understood. I will do it now. I will try to gather them all within 100 years. Oh, 50 years. About the sacred beasts? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. There is no need to be so anxious. I'll give you 500 years. Just come back when the time comes. Tell them that we're not fighting this time. We're just finding a place for them to settle down. I won't force the holy beasts. That's your own business. Fat Otaku immediately perked up. Other people might not be able to find a good place, but how could Lu Thai be bad at finding a good place? Understood, understood. Don't worry, as long as I release the news, one or two of them will come back in less than 100 years. It's not reliable to count on them to find a treasure ground, so senior brother has to do it. Senior marshal brother, where's this place you're talking about? Lu Xiaoyi didn't say it out loud. You'll know when you come back. It's not the right time to announce it. Fat Swordsman did not dare to ask too many questions as he was afraid that he would disturb Fatty's plans. After all these years, the growth of this young swordsman was terrifying. He was no longer the timid and cautious Yuanying that he used to be when they first met. Standing beside him, Fat Otaku could feel a threatening aura, as if he was the ruler of the universe. Fat Otaku's only worry was that swordsmen were all one-track minded. They looked fine in the front, but they couldn't think straight in the back. Fat Otaku's only worry was that the swordsman had a hard time. Lu Xiaoyi was about to leave when he stopped and asked, "If there's a new place, will you miss this place?" Fat Otaku stared blankly inside. Of course, it's hard to leave one's homeland. Not only humans, it's the same for us immemorial beasts. If we can keep this place, even if the spiritual opportunity is lacking, we can accept it. Unfortunately, who knows what this place will become in the future? Lu Xiaoyi leaped into the air and went higher and higher. He adjusted his altitude and tried to observe the Heaven's Choice continent from all angles. His powerful divine sense swept across the land without any restraint, causing many cultivators to be on guard. They didn't know who was searching for whom. He wasn't searching for anyone. He was sweeping across the continent. What disappointed him was that the higher he flew, the wider he could see. However, his divine sense couldn't penetrate far into the ground. It stopped at a mere 100 li, so it was meaningless. The thickness of the Heaven's Choice continent was more than 10 million li. It wasn't something his divine sense could completely penetrate. Even if he landed on the ground and went deep into the Earth's crust, his divine sense could only reach 1,000 li. This was mainly because the Earth pulp absorbed his divine sense. However, if he drilled into the Earth's crust, he would lose control of the entire structure of the continent. He was in a dilemma. It was impossible to separate such a huge object by force. The only way was, as the Golden Immortal had said, to find the edges of the Heaven's Choice continent when it was formed, and then use those edges of the Earth's crust that were not stable and had a low degree of adhesion to separate it. How many celestial bodies did the Heaven's Choice continent consist of? Historical records said that there were more than 200 pieces. This number didn't include those small meteorites and the like. In reality, there must be more than this. Outside of historical records, a conservative estimate was close to 500 celestial bodies. Of course, it was impossible to separate them into 500 pieces. There were many ways to do it. For example, choosing the largest 10 pieces or dozens of pieces, and those plates that were tightly glued together could be considered as one. It was unimaginable how much effort would be put into this kind of geological research. In this cultivation world, no one had the interest to record the shape of each celestial body after it was glued together with the Heaven's Choice continent. It was impossible to record it clearly because the plates of the Earth's crust were compressed and changed. Some places would be completely compressed and fused together. Some places would form faults, which was the source of earthquakes. It was too complicated. Sometimes he would think, what was the point of finding such trouble for himself? Was it to bemoan the state of the universe and pity the fate of mankind. He didn't seem to have such universal love. He wasn't a saint, he never was. The change of eras wasn't caused by him. He was just one of the millions of speculators in this process, the one who placed a bigger bet. Even if a tragedy really happened to the Heaven's Choice continent, he wouldn't be the one to blame. This was the truth. From the Golden Immortal's mouth, he knew Hong Mao's intention. Even Hong didn't dare to casually touch such a difficult problem. Therefore, Hong Mao was inclined to delay this problem until after the new era to make things difficult for San Hong. This was a very normal choice, but it could also be seen why Hong Mao couldn't rise to the top for thousands of years. It lacked the spirit to go all out and forge ahead. Of course, for a rule, one couldn't expect it to be hot-blooded or take on more responsibilities. The characteristic of a rule was that it had to make precise calculations and then find the most suitable path. But it was also because of this methodicality that San Hong could completely suppress it. Because no matter how it calculated, it couldn't be considered the joint efforts of San Hong. Chapter 2364. Lu Xiaoyi could have chosen the same strategy as Hong Mao, not mentioning this problem and leaving everything to Hong. But after much consideration, he decided to face the problem himself. There were many reasons. His future superego was Hong. This meant that when he did things, he should always use Hong's standards to judge himself. It was fine if he didn't know, but if he pretended not to know, it was denying himself. To put it simply, the life of a maid was the master's heart. Did the changes in the Heaven's Choice continent really have nothing to do with him? Maybe, but it definitely had something to do with the sword vein in Li Wuya. After going around in circles, it had something to do with him. Since it was related with his personality, he wouldn't pretend not to see it. He would definitely solve it in advance. His ambition was to overturn the cultivation order of the entire immortal court. He was a troublemaker. Perhaps in the eyes of the heavenly Tao, he was also someone who couldn't be controlled. Then, why should the heavenly Tao tolerate his betrayal? And three of them at the same time? The heavenly Tao wasn't his father? He had to do something to let the heavenly Tao know that he wasn't an unreasonable person, that he wasn't a troublemaker just for the sake of causing trouble, that he still believed in order, that he was someone who always cared about the common people. He needed to do something big to show his attitude, to let the heavenly Tao see that other than causing trouble, he also had his own merits. Only then could it tacitly approve of the changes he was about to make. When you want to do something very subversive, you have to do something very traditional, beautiful, and loving at the same time. This was balance. In the end, even if his heart was like stone, he knew that if the Heaven's Choice continent was allowed to return to the main world in the new era, there would be countless deaths and injuries. He couldn't completely ignore it. He wasn't a stone now. He still had his own feelings. He could tolerate deaths and injuries, but that would only be after his efforts failed. If he didn't work hard, how could he forgive himself? This was his current mentality. He climbed out a hole, then jumped into an even deeper hole with his eyes wide open. Never tired of it. Never tired of courting death. Then now, it was time to go to the land of the Yellow Dragon. While observing other people's great Taos, he also began to establish his own great Tao. His worry for the Heaven's Choice continent was ultimately a preparation for establishing his Tao. Packaging, creating momentum, doing good deeds, everything was for the sake of his final goal. After leaving the Heaven's Choice continent and leaving the origin world, he didn't go to Zhou again. There had to be a limit to how much they could be intimate with each other. The most important thing was to have a psychological comfort and not be intimate with each other. This time, he used the interior heaven as a rotation point and placed the projection point at the land of the Yellow Dragon. The next moment, he appeared far away from the land of the Yellow Dragon. Qing Xian would need 20 years to make such a trip, but he did not need it. 10 years would suffice. In the light and shadow, he could clearly feel that there were many cultivators flying towards the Yellow Dragon's land. Although it was still a bit early to fly to the Yellow Dragon's land, everyone had their own thoughts. Many of them had staked their futures on the Yellow Dragon's land. If they could not achieve anything, they would rather not go back. He died in the land of the Yellow Dragon and became the background of this historical moment. It was very tragic and stirring, but this was cultivation. 10 years later, Lu Xiaoyi arrived at the place that had now become the only topic of discussion in the cultivation world of the universe. At first glance, it seemed like the number of cultivators had already exceeded 100,000. He didn't know where so many half-immortals and monarchs came from, but he could foresee that this was just the beginning. Around this space, close to 100,000 cultivators were scattered and suspended in the air. For most of them, once they came here, they would never leave again unless a new era came. Only those half-immortals who could circulate through the interior and exterior heavens had the ability to come and go as they pleased here. 2,000 years? For many monarchs who still had lifespan left, this was not a difficult matter. There were also very few Yuanying who were staking everything here. They would either use the land of the Yellow Dragon to become a monarch or die here. This kind of desperate situation was also very common in the cultivation world. It was to use a major event to increase one's realm. Everyone had their own goals and thoughts, but the only rule here was that meaningless fighting was prohibited. Otherwise, one would be attacked by a group. Of course, no one would come here to fight and kill at this juncture. It was completely unreasonable. If you had resentment, you could go to the other party's Tao tablet to vent it. If you wanted to stand out and attract attention, you could go and establish your own Tao. Immediately, countless comments covered the sky and earth. The real arena was in this space. The surrounding space was still sparse, but this sparse was only in comparison to the vast space. In fact, the number of Tao steels here was increasing at an extremely fast speed. When Qing Xian first came here, there were only slightly over 1,000 Tao steels. Less than 200 years had passed, and now, there were already over 3,000 Tao steels erected here. Lu Xiaoyi slowly approached this space in a low-key manner. When everyone's attention was on the Tao tablets inside, very few people were paying attention to who was passing by. There were close to 100,000 people outside. Most of them had the intention to observe. They knew that if they went up, they would only be embarrassing themselves. But if they could gain some enlightenment from the Tao state of the tide leaders, that would be the best reward. It could help them to gain the clearest Tao distribution and tide of the new era. The Tao tablets in Tianzi continent had already become a thing of the past. The Tao tablets here represented the future. This was also the real reason why Tianzi continent was declining. When the tree falls, the monkeys scatter. When the Tao tablets were no longer popular, who would still stay there? But there were also those who were crafty, or rather cautious. They had the strength to establish a tablet, and they were very strong. But they still observed from the outside. They kept going in and out of other people's Tao tablets, especially those that were related to themselves. They wanted to learn from them and enrich themselves. They learned from other strong points to make up for their weaknesses. They wanted to amaze the world with a single brilliant feat when establishing their Tao. Of course, those who had already established their Tao had the opportunity to improve. The owner of the Tao tablets didn't require you to stay inside after establishing your Tao. You could also go in and out freely. While establishing your Tao for others to evaluate, you could also go around and learn from others' things. Actually, it was a process of stealing and plagiarizing. It was an open book exam. But things like Tao weren't something that could be solved by plagiarizing. It required years of immersion and in-depth study. It required one to take a different path. It required a lot of time to form one's own things. For example, if you were both in the pure yang realm and you saw that someone else's pure yang was not bad, you would go and learn from them. But if you only learned a little, it would be useless. Once you learn more, you would fall into someone else's rhythm. Then, you would move these completely other people's rhythm back to your own Tao tablet. In the end, when the heavenly Tao judged you, it would tacitly recognize you as someone else's branch, and you would lose the qualifications to establish your own Tao. The competition had already begun, so everyone who had the intention to establish their Tao wished to understand more about the standards and direction of other people's Tao state. but they didn't dare to go too deep into it. They were afraid that the more they learned, the more reasonable they would become. In the end, they would become a fan of other people's Tao state. Their own Tao state wasn't even there. There were already many cultivators who viewed themselves in this kind of observation. There was no smoke, but it was still cruel. Chapter 2365. To cultivators who paid special attention to the state of mind, relying on sneakily solving the great Tao heavenly chasm was not the attitude of a Taoist. The normal process was to enter other people's Tao steels lightly and skim through them, focusing on the direction and domain, not the specific details. This was the true learning attitude. In learning from each other, the most feared thing was to be led into a ditch by others. This was a taboo before the great Tao was formed. That was why they were divided into two groups. Some were eager to set up a steel and fix what they thought was unique first. Then it would not be counted as plagiarism. Some were not in a hurry to set up a steel. They were confident that their hearts would be firm, and they would see more and think more. When they set up their Tao, they would be very comprehensive and not endlessly sewing and patching. These were determined by their personality and habits, and there was no fixed number. Lu Xiaoyi had just arrived. When he was in the fifth ring, he did not have time to communicate with his friends who had set up steels, so he still had some doubts. He looked around and wanted to find someone to clear his doubts. Although he would naturally know everything after staying here for a long time, he had a mouth and was here to ask questions. Clearly, a question could be solved with a few words, so why bother to investigate it himself? He did not have the modesty of a half-immortal cultivator at all. Here, everyone was on the same starting line. In the surrounding space, most of the cultivators had their eyes closed and were immersed in their own great Tao. Few gathered together to chat. Of course, there were all kinds of birds in the forest. There were also those who liked to teach others, those who liked to gossip, and those who exchanged information. Not far away, there was such a group of people, men and women. There were perfected lords and half-immortals. They gathered together and chatted happily. Who knew if they were from the same orthodoxy or the same domain? The land of Yellow Dragon was also a rare stage. It gave the seniors and juniors who had not seen each other for a long time a chance to gather. Therefore, the juniors often had feelings of admiration, and the seniors also had the intention to give them advice. It was also an opportunity to teach them on the spot. After all, there were thousands of vivid examples placed there. They were excellent teaching materials that could not be encountered normally. Since they were all chatting, of course, he could go over and disturb them. He was the shitty Lu, not the kitchen god Lu. It was not to the point where everyone knew him. When all the cultivators in the universe gathered here, in fact, most people still did not know him. Sorry to disturb you. It's my first time here, so there are still some things that I don't understand. Fellow Taoists, I see that all of you are relaxed. Obviously, you know a lot about this place. Can I ask you a few questions? There are more than 10 people in this group. Judging from their auras, they should be from a certain sect. But which celestial body did they come from? Cultivators rarely asked about the secrets of their origins. If you have something to say, just say it. Why do you want to know where my family is? Among them, there were two half-immortals, one Qian and one Kuan. It seemed like they were the great ancestors of this orthodoxy. Now that they were together with their own sect members who came to the Yellow Dragon, of course, they had the intention to guide them. Qian Xiu was very courteous. It's fine. Since we've come to the Yellow Dragon land, we're all family. There's no such thing as first come, first served. I've been in Yellow Dragon for 100 years. I don't dare to say that I know everything, but I know the general rules. Fellow Taoist, feel free to ask. I will tell you everything I know. Kuan Xiu was very beautiful and looked like a standard fairy. However, the way she spoke was a little indescribable. Other people come here to quietly observe. Why does fellow Taoist open your mouth and ask? There are some things that others say may not be as real as experiencing it yourself. Lu Xiaoyi was all smiles. I'm lazy and have a short temper. I came late, so I could only open my mouth. It's like this. I see that this space doesn't allow cultivators to enter. Qianxiu nodded. That's right. There are too many cultivators here, and too many people have messy hands. They all surround the Dao steels they're interested in, so others can't observe. It's like a market, so you can only watch from afar. Unless you enter the Dao steels. Kuan Xiu shook her head. Why should I go in? It's like shopping in the mortal world. If you keep haggling and commenting, you won't buy in the end. It's a waste of people's feelings and affects people's business. You can either set up your own stall or go in and try. Those who wander around the market are mostly thieves. If you want to go in and wander around, do you want to be a Dao thief? Observing other people's Dao state, going in to observe and absorb it completely, would be suspected of plagiarism. However, if you comprehended it outside, the heavenly Dao wouldn't take it seriously. What Kuan Xiu meant was, if you wander around outside the Dao steels, are you trying to steal the Dao? Lu Xiaoyi wasn't angry. He kind of understood the origin of this orthodoxy. It was a very different, very famous, and very funny orthodoxy in the cultivation world. It was called whether or not the Tao was. This orthodoxy was an orthodoxy that cultivated the heart. It was divided into two branches. One was yes, and the other was no. Those who cultivated the Tao were like Qian Xiu. They said yes to everything and were good people. Those who cultivated the no Tao were like Kuan Xiu. They opposed everything and went against everything.